She stood on that auction block with nothing left but her name. No family, no future, just the hollow promise of a man who'd vanished like morning fog. The crowd jeered. The auctioneer's voice cracked with embarrassment. $10. That's all one cowboy offered for a woman the world had already thrown away. But sometimes salvation doesn't come wrapped in gold. It comes in dust, leather, and the quiet resolve of a man who'd forgotten how to care until her. Stay with us until the end of this story, and comment below with your city so we can see how far this tale has traveled. The Montana Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the makeshift auction platform, turning the dusty main street of Benton's Crossing into a shimmering haze of heat and desperation. Elara Wynn stood motionless on the wooden planks, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, trying to maintain some fragment of dignity as dozens of eyes raked over her like she was livestock. The purple bruise along her jawline had faded to a sickly yellow-green, a parting gift from the man who'd promised her forever and delivered only ruin. "Come now, gentlemen." The auctioneer's voice had taken on a pleading quality that made Elara's stomach turn. "Surely someone needs a housemaid, a cook. She's young, healthy, and can read and write better than most of you." A few men in the crowd chuckled at that, but not kindly. Elara kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, on the purple mountains that rimmed the valley like a fortress wall. If she looked at their faces, at the mixture of pity, contempt, and hunger in their eyes, she'd break, and she'd be damned if she'd give them that satisfaction. 3 weeks ago, she'd stepped off the stagecoach from St. Louis with a carpet bag, a letter of promise, and a heart full of foolish hope. Michael Chandler had courted her through correspondence for 8 months, his letters painting pictures of a prosperous mercantile business, a house with a white picket fence, a life of comfort on the frontier. She'd sold everything she owned to make the journey west, leaving behind the suffocating propriety of her aunt's house for the promise of love and independence. The reality had been brutally different. Michael Chandler existed, all right, but the mercantile was mortgaged to the hilt, the house belonged to someone else, and his promises were as empty as his pockets. What he'd wanted was a free worker and a bed warmer, not a wife. When she'd refused him on both counts, he'd grown violent. The bruise on her jaw was nothing compared to the one on her ribs, hidden beneath the plain calico dress that had once been a soft blue, but was now stained with dust and sweat. 2 days after their confrontation, Michael had disappeared, leaving her stranded at a boarding house with no money, no prospects, and a landlady who'd wasted no time selling her contract to settle his debts. Contract labor was legal in the territory, barely, and for women with no family and no resources, it was only a step above slavery. $5, someone called out, and Elara's eyes snapped to the voice. A heavy-set man with a greasy beard and a saloon owner's calculating gaze. She knew his type, had seen enough of them lurking outside the boarding house. Her hands trembled, but she forced them still. $5 to Mr. Grimes, the auctioneer said, relief flooding his voice. "Do I hear 6? Silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even in a place as rough as Benton's Crossing, there were lines that decent men didn't cross, and everyone knew what kind of work Grimes would put her to in the saloon. But decent men weren't the ones who bid on desperate women at public auctions. 5 going once? Elara's throat constricted. She'd heard stories about the saloon girls in Grimes's establishment. None of them survived more than a few years before drink, disease, or despair claimed them. She'd rather die on her own terms than live like that. Her eyes darted around the platform, looking for an escape route, calculating whether she could make it to the edge of town before they caught her. 5 going twice? Wait. The voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade, quiet but absolute. The crowd parted and Elara's gaze landed on a man standing at the back, half in shadow cast by the general store's awning. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with shoulders broadened by years of hard labor. Dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples fell almost to his collar, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed a face that looked like it had been carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountains behind him. But it was his eyes that caught her, pale blue, almost gray, and completely unreadable. He wore dusty work clothes, boots that had seen better years, and a Stetson that had weathered countless storms. The auctioneer squinted. Jonas Hale? Didn't expect to see you at one of these affairs. Neither did I. Jonas moved forward with the economical grace of a man accustomed to moving through difficult terrain. He stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at Alara, his expression betraying nothing. "What's the bid at?" $5 to Mr. Grimes, but if you're interested, $10, Jonas said flatly. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Grimes's face darkened. "Now hold on, Hale. I was here first." "Then you should have bid higher." Jonas didn't even look at him. His eyes remained locked on Alara's, and for the first time since Michael had shattered her illusions, she felt something other than fear or despair. She wasn't sure what it was, recognition, maybe, or the strange sense that this man saw past the bruises and the humiliation to something essential beneath. $10, the auctioneer practically shouted, banging his gavel before anyone could object. "Sold to Jonas Hale. Sir, if you'll just sign the contract." "Burn the contract." Jonas pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket and counted out 10 silver dollars with steady hand. "I'm not buying a person. I'm offering work, fair wage, and a roof. She can leave whenever she wants." The auctioneer's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. That's not how this works, Mr. Hale. That's how it works with me." Jonas's voice hadn't risen, but there was steel underneath the quiet. "You want the money or not?" For a long moment, the auctioneer stared at him, clearly weighing the irregularity against the desire to be done with the whole sordid business. Finally, he snatched the coins from Jonas's palm. "Fine. She's your problem now." Jonas turned to Alara and extended his hand up to the platform. "Can you ride?" She blinked, thrown by the sudden practicality of the question. Yes. I grew up on a farm before." She stopped, not wanting to explain the orphanage, the move to St. Louis, the slow suffocation of her aunt's parlor. "Good. My horse can carry double for now." He kept his hand extended, patient, waiting for her to make the choice. Alara looked at that outstretched hand, calloused, scarred, steady, and then at the crowd beginning to disperse with disappointed or relieved expressions. She looked at Grimes, whose piggish eyes promised that this wasn't over. She looked at the mountains in the distance, those purple sentinels that had watched her humiliation with ancient indifference. Then she placed her hand in Jonas Hale's and let him help her down from the platform. His grip was firm but careful, mindful of her bruises even though she hadn't told him about them. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver thread through his dark hair, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as if he was already regretting his impulse. He was older than she'd first thought, mid-30s maybe, and carried himself with the wariness of a man who'd learned not to trust easily. "Thank you," she whispered, and hated how her voice shook. Jonas released her hand and stepped back, establishing distance. "Don't thank me yet. The ranch is an hour's ride, and it's not much to look at. Work's hard. Winters are harder. If you've got delicate sensibilities, you won't last a week." "My sensibilities died on the stagecoach from St. Louis," Alara said, lifting her chin. "And I'm stronger than I look." Something flickered in those pale eyes. Surprise, maybe, or approval. "We'll see. Come on, storm's coming in, and I'd rather be home before it hits." He led her to where a dun-colored horse stood patiently hitched to the rail outside the general store. The animal was well cared for, its coat brushed clean despite the dust, its tack mended but functional. Jonas swung into the saddle with practiced ease, then reached down for her. "Put your foot on mine and grab my arm." Alara did as instructed, and a moment later she was seated behind him, her carpet bag clutched in one hand while the other instinctively gripped his shoulder for balance. The horse shifted beneath them, adjusting to the extra weight, and then Jonas clicked his tongue and they were moving. As Benton's crossing fell away behind them, Alara felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease fractionally. The man in front of her was a stranger who'd just bought her at an auction, no matter how he dressed it up, but he'd also stood between her and Grimes. That counted for something in this hard country where mercy was scarcer than water. They rode in silence for a long time, following a track that wound through sagebrush and scattered pines. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Alara could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath the calico dress. True to Jonas's prediction, dark clouds were building over the mountains, stacking up like bruises against the sky. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, having to raise her voice slightly over the sound of hoofbeats. Why bid on me? Jonas didn't answer immediately. His back was rigid, his posture revealing nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Been running that ranch alone for 3 years. House is falling apart. Could use someone who knows how to cook something besides beans and jerky. That's all. It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. Elara had seen something in his eyes back there on the platform. Some flicker of recognition or memory that went deeper than needing a housekeeper. But she was in no position to press, and maybe it didn't matter anyway. Everyone out here was running from something. The West was built on other people's secrets and second chances. What happened to your last housekeeper? She asked instead. Never had one. Been on my own since I bought the place. Family? Dead. The word came out flat and final, a door slamming shut on further questions. Elara fell silent, understanding that particular tone all too well. She'd used it herself often enough when people asked about her parents, about why she'd come west alone, about the poor choices that had led her to that auction block. The track climbed gradually into the foothill, the terrain growing rockier and more dramatic. Ponderosa pines began to appear in greater numbers, their russet bark glowing warm in the late afternoon light. A creek tumbled down from the heights, and Jonas guided the horse across at a shallow ford, the water rushing cold around the animal's leg. How much farther? Elara asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing off the mountain slopes. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and Elara shivered in her thin dress. Without a word, Jonas shrugged out of his denim jacket and passed it back to her, never breaking the horse's steady rhythm. You'll need it more than me, he said when she hesitated. Storm's going to break any minute. The jacket was warm from his body and smelled of leather, wood smoke, and something indefinable that was simply him, earth and pine and hard work. Elara pulled it on gratefully, swimming in the 2 large sleeves, and allowed herself to slump slightly against his back for stability. She felt him stiffen briefly, then relax, accepting the contact as necessary rather than familiar. The first fat drops of rain began falling just as they crested a rise, and the ranch came into view. It wasn't much, as Jonas had warned. A single-story log cabin with a sagging porch sat in a small valley cleared from the surrounding forest. Behind it stood a barn that had seen better days. One corner of the roof dipped worryingly. A corral held 2 more horses who lifted their heads at their approach, whinnying greeting. A few outbuildings clustered nearby. A smokehouse, what looked like a workshop, a chicken coop where a few bedraggled hens pecked at the dirt. But the land itself was beautiful. The valley was sheltered on 3 sides by pine-covered slopes, with the creek they'd crossed running through its center. Wildflowers dotted the meadow grass despite the late season, Indian paintbrush and columbine and wild roses. It was isolated, certainly. Probably the nearest neighbor was miles away. But it was also peaceful in a way that made Elara's chest ache with unexpected longing. Home, Jonas said, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone. Like I said, it's not much. It's more than I have, Elara replied honestly. And the land is beautiful. He glanced back at her, surprise flickering across his face, as if he'd expected her to be disappointed or dismayed. Yeah, it is that. The rain began in earnest as Jonas guided the horse to the barn. He dismounted first, then helped Elara down, his hands careful around her waist. The moment her feet touched solid ground, he released her and stepped back, that same wariness returning to his expression. Go on up to the house, he said, pulling the saddle from the horse with practiced efficiency. Door's unlocked. I need to get the animals settled before this storm gets worse. I can help. You're soaked through already. His tone brooked no argument. Get inside, get dry. There's a fire laid in the stove, matches on the mantle. I'll be up in 20 minutes. Elara wanted to argue, wanted to prove that she could pull her weight despite everything, but the truth was she was exhausted, chilled to the bone, and starting to shake from delayed shock. So she simply nodded, clutched her carpet bag tighter, and ran through the rain to the cabin. The door, as promised, was unlocked. Elara pushed inside and stood dripping on the threshold, taking in her new reality. The cabin was spartanly furnished but clean, cleaner than she'd expected for a bachelor's quarters. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple wooden chair pulled up beside it. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat near the kitchen area, where a cast-iron stove, a dry sink, and open shelves stocked with basic supplies occupied the space. A single bed was pushed against the far wall, its quilts military neat. No pictures on the walls. No books. No personal touches except a rifle mounted above the fireplace and a pair of worn saddlebags hanging from a peg by the door. It was the home of a man who expected nothing from life but work and survival. Alara set her carpet bag down and found the matches where Jonas had said they'd be. Her hands shook as she lit the kindling in the stove, but within minutes a cheerful fire was crackling, beginning to chase the chill from the room. She stood before it, still wearing Jonas's jacket, and let the warmth seep into her bones while outside the storm raged in earnest. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and Alara jumped despite herself. Through the window, she could see Jonas moving through the barn doors, checking on the animals one last time before securing everything against the weather. Lightning illuminated his silhouette briefly, tall, solitary, purposeful, and then darkness swallowed him again. Who was Jonas Hale? What had happened to make him so isolated, so careful with his words and his distance? And what had made him break his own pattern to bid on a desperate woman at an auction he'd probably never attended? The door opened, admitting a gust of wind and rain, and Jonas himself, soaked to the skin and tracking mud. He stopped just inside, looking at the fire, at Alara standing before it in his jacket, and something complicated crossed his face. Too quick to read, too complex to name. "You found the matches," he said unnecessarily. "Yes, and I can cook if you'll show me what you have." Jonas pulled off his hat and hung it on a peg, water streaming from its brim. "Not tonight. You've been through enough. I've got some salt pork and cornbread from yesterday. That'll do." "Mr. Hale." Jonas. He moved past her to the kitchen area, keeping careful space between them. "If we're living under the same roof, might as well use first name." "What's yours?" the auctioneer didn't say. "Alara. Alara Wynn." "Alara." He said it carefully, as if testing the weight of it. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep in the barn." "Absolutely not." The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "This is your house, your bed. I won't displace you." Jonas turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw something like amusement in those pale eyes. "You've got steel in you after all. All right, I'll rig up a curtain, give you some privacy. But I'm not sleeping in the barn during a storm, so we'll have to make do." "That's fair." They regarded each other across the cabin. 2 damaged people, 2 survivors, bound together by necessity, and $10 silver. The storm hammered against the roof, and the fire crackled in the stove, and somewhere in the silence between them, an unspoken agreement formed. This would be a partnership of convenience, nothing more. He wouldn't pry into her past, and she wouldn't pry into his. They would work side by side, maintaining whatever distance was necessary to keep things safe and simple. But as Jonas turned back to preparing their simple meal, and as Alara finally peeled off his jacket and hung it carefully on a peg, both of them carried the same secret knowledge. Some agreements were easier to make than to keep, and some distances, once bridged, could never be rebuilt quite the same way again. The storm lasted through the night, and Alara barely slept. The bed was comfortable enough, more comfortable than the boarding house cot she'd endured for the past weeks. But every crack of thunder, every gust of wind rattling the shutters, brought back the memory of standing on that auction platform under hostile eyes. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Jonas to reveal himself as another Michael Chandler, all false promises and hidden cruelty. But when dawn broke gray and drizzly over the valley, Jonas was simply up before her, already dressed and moving quietly around the cabin so as not to wake her. Through the canvas curtain he'd rigged the night before, she heard him banking the stove, heard the clink of the coffee pot, heard the soft creak of the door as he went out to check on the animals. Alara rose quickly, smoothing her wrinkled dress, the only one she owned now, and emerged from behind the curtain. Jonas had left coffee warming on the stove and a note scrawled on a scrap of paper. Gone to check the fence line. Storm might have brought down trees back by noon. Jay. She stood alone in the cabin, holding that terse note, and felt something unknot in her chest. He'd left her alone, unsupervised, free to go through his things, to steal what little he had, to simply walk away if she wanted. The fact that he trusted her, or perhaps simply didn't care enough to guard against her, felt like the first genuine kindness she'd received since arriving in Montana. Alara poured herself coffee and surveyed the cabin properly in the morning light. It was even more Spartan from what she'd first thought. The furniture was handmade but functional. The dishes were tin and enamel, mismatched but clean. The pantry held basic staples: flour, cornmeal, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar. No luxuries, no excesses. But also no dirt, no empty whiskey bottles. None of the signs of a man who'd given up on himself. Jonas Hale might be isolated and taciturn, but he wasn't broken. Not completely. Alara finished her coffee, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. By the time Jonas returned 3 hours later, soaked again from the intermittent rain, the cabin had been transformed. The dishes were washed and stacked neatly. The floor had been swept clean of trapped mud. The bed was made with hospital corners. The pantry had been reorganized logically. A pot of beans and salt pork simmered on the stove, filling the cabin with savory smells. And Alara had even found a half-sprouted potato in the corner and planted it in a tin can on the windowsill, a tiny, stubborn gesture toward permanence. Jonas stopped in the doorway, taking it all in with an unreadable expression. Finally, he said, "Beans smell good. They'll be better with the wild onions I found growing by the creek. And tomorrow I'll make biscuits if you have lard." In the pantry, second shelf. He hung up his hat and jacket, then paused. "Alara?" She turned from the stove, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Yes?" "You didn't have to do all this. Not today." "I know." She met his eyes steadily. "But sitting idle makes me think, and thinking right now isn't helpful. Work is better." Something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, of a kindred spirit. "Yeah, I know that feeling." They ate together at the small table, and if the conversation was minimal, it was at least not uncomfortable. Jonas asked about her skills, what kind of work she could do, and seemed surprised when she rattled off a list that included gardening, preserving, basic animal husbandry, mending, and accounts. "My father had a farm," she explained. "Small one, but we kept it running with just the three of us. Him, my mother, and me. I did most of the garden and the chickens." "What happened to them?" "Cholera, 8 years ago." She said it simply, without emotion, the way you spoke about old pain that had scarred over. "My aunt took me in, but she was different. City life, parlors and calling cards and pretending everything was fine when it wasn't." Jonas nodded slowly. "So you answered an advertisement from a stranger promising a better life out west?" "Yes." Alara didn't flinch from the implicit criticism. "It was stupid, I see that now, but anything seemed better than slowly suffocating in my aunt's house, pretending to be something I wasn't." "Not stupid," Jonas said quietly. "Desperate, maybe, but not stupid. Half the people out here came on similar promises. The difference is, most of them worked out better than yours did." They finished eating in silence, and then Jonas pushed back from the table. "I need to get back to work. Fence needs mending, and I've got to check on the cattle up in the high pasture. I'll come with you." He frowned. "It's rough country. Still raining. I can handle rough country and rain, and I need to learn the land if I'm going to be useful here." She kept her voice level, matter of fact, giving him no room to argue based on delicate sensibilities she no longer possessed. Jonas studied her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "All right, but I'm not going slow for you, and I'm not carrying you back if you twist an ankle." "Fair enough." They went out together into the drizzle, and Alara discovered that Jonas hadn't been exaggerating about the work. The fence line ran for miles, enclosing rough pasture land that climbed into the foothills. Several sections had indeed been knocked down by falling branches during the storm, and repairing them required heavy lifting, precise hammering, and the kind of stubborn persistence that only came from necessity. Jonas worked with focused efficiency, his movements economical and practiced. Alara did what she could, holding posts steady, gathering scattered tools, clearing debris, and if he noticed her wincing when the work aggravated her barely healed ribs, he had the grace not to mention it. By mid-afternoon, they were both exhausted and soaked through, but the fence was repaired and the cattle, 30 head of mixed breeds, were accounted for. As they trudged back toward the cabin, Jonas said, "You kept up." It It wasn't quite praise, but it wasn't criticism either. Alara accepted it as the closest thing to approval she was likely to get. Told you I was stronger than I looked. Yeah. He glanced at her sidelong. You did. That night, they fell into a routine that would define the weeks to come. Alara cooked while Jonas tended the animals. They ate together. They cleaned up together. And then, as darkness settled over the valley, they sat by the fire. Jonas in his chair, Alara on the floor with her back against the log wall, and talked. Not about anything deep or revealing, not at first, just practical matters. What supplies they'd need from town, which repairs were most urgent, how to handle the approaching winter. But gradually, as the nights accumulated, the conversations deepened. Alara learned that Jonas had bought the ranch 3 years ago, using money from something he wouldn't specify. That he'd come to Montana to escape. Something else he wouldn't specify. That he was 34 years old, had no living family, and had fully intended to live out his days alone until some impulse he couldn't explain had driven him to that auction. I told myself I was just going into town for supplies, he admitted one night, staring into the fire. Heard about the auction, figured I'd see what the fuss was about. Wasn't planning to bid. What changed your mind? Jonas was quiet for so long that Alara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, your eyes. You were scared. Anyone could see that. But you weren't broken. You still had fight in you. And I thought, he trailed off, shaking his head. Thought what? Thought maybe if you still had fight after everything that brought you to that platform, then maybe there was hope for the rest of us too. Alara felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed since Michael's betrayal. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing that. For everything. Jonas shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to gratitude. You're earning your keep, no need for thanks. But they both knew it was more than that. The cabin was warmer now, not just because Alara kept the stove going, but because another person's presence changed the fundamental nature of the space. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was companionable. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls Jonas had built around himself began to develop cracks. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, Alara woke to find Jonas already gone, and another note on the table, going to town for supplies. Back tomorrow night, don't wait up. Jay. She spent the day working on the cabin's many deficiencies, patching the chinking between logs, oiling hinges, scrubbing years of bachelor grime from corners Jonas probably hadn't even noticed were dirty. But as dusk approached and she found herself alone in the isolated valley, with night coming on, the anxiety she'd been suppressing came flooding back. What if Jonas didn't come back? What if this had been some elaborate cruelty, bringing her out here only to abandon her? What if Grimes had caught up with him in town, convinced him that keeping Alara wasn't worth the trouble? The thoughts spiraled as darkness fell. Alara tried to sleep but couldn't, listening to every crack and rustle outside, remembering that she was miles from the nearest neighbor with no horse and no idea how to find her way out of these mountains. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching in the dead of night, she was standing by the window with Jonas's rifle in her hands, unloaded, because she had no idea where he kept the ammunition, but holding it made her feel slightly less helpless. The door opened and Jonas stopped dead at the sight of her standing there armed. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Jonas slowly raised his hands, non-threatening, his expression carefully neutral. Easy, he said quietly. Just me. Alara lowered the rifle, shame flooding through her. I'm sorry, I thought that I'd abandoned you. He said it without judgment, stepping inside and closing the door. Can't blame you for thinking it. You've got reason not to trust. You came back. Her voice shook despite her attempt at control. Said I would. People say a lot of things. Jonas nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd put into words. He moved past her to hang up his hat, then turned back. Alara, look at me. She did, meeting those pale blue eyes. I'm not Michael Chandler. I'm not any of the men who've hurt you or let you down. When I say something, I mean it. If I tell you I'll be back, I'll be back. And if circumstances ever change, if I can't keep you on, if the ranch fails, whatever, I'll tell you straight, and I'll make sure you've got passage back to civilization and money enough to start over. You have my word on that. Why? The question burst out before she could stop it. Why do you care? You don't even know me. Jonas was quiet, and in the lamplight she could see the exhaustion on his face, the toll that the trip to town and back had taken. Maybe because someone showed me kindness once, when I didn't deserve it. And maybe I'm just trying to pay that forward before it's too late. Before she could ask what he meant by too late, he was moving toward his saddlebags, pulling out supplies. Got you something in town. Figured you could use it. He held out a package wrapped in brown paper. Alara took it with trembling hands and unwrapped it to find a dress. Simple, practical, but new and in her size. A dress that wasn't stained or torn or carrying the memory of every terrible thing that had happened since she'd left St. Louis. The tears came then, sudden and unstoppable. She tried to hide them, turning away, but Jonas had already seen. "Hey," he said awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with emotional displays. "If it doesn't fit, I can..." "It's perfect." Alara wiped her eyes fiercely. "I'm sorry. I don't usually..." "You've earned the right to cry," Jonas said quietly. "God knows you've been holding it together better than most would. So go ahead. I'll be outside checking on the horses." He left her alone with her tears and her new dress and the overwhelming relief of knowing that he'd come back, just as he'd promised. And later, when she finally composed herself and Jonas returned to the cabin, neither of them mentioned the moment. But something had shifted between them again. Another layer of defense peeled away. Another small step toward something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was moving in that direction. The days settled into a rhythm. Work, meals, conversation, sleep. The routine was punctuated by small kindnesses on both sides. Jonas leaving wildflowers on the table after his morning chores, Alara mending the torn seam in his favorite shirt, Jonas teaching her to shoot properly after finding her with the rifle that night, Alara learning exactly how he liked his coffee and making it without being asked. The valley moved toward autumn, and the aspen leaves turned golden against the dark green pines. The work grew harder as they prepared for winter, cutting wood, smoking meat, shoring up the barn's weakened roof. But it was good work, honest work, and Alara found herself stronger each day, her body remembering skills her aunt had tried to make her forget. And Jonas, taciturn, careful Jonas, began to talk more. Not much, and never about whatever had driven him to this isolated valley, but enough that Alara began to see the man beneath the armor. He was intelligent, well-read, despite the lack of books in the cabin. He was fair in his dealings with her, never asking more than he was willing to give. And occasionally, when something struck him as funny, he would smile, just a slight curve of the mouth, gone almost before it appeared. And Alara found herself working to earn those rare smiles like they were precious currency. 2 months into her time at the ranch, Alara was hanging laundry when she heard riders approaching. 3 men on horseback, moving with the casual confidence of people who believed they owned the world. She recognized the type immediately, the same type as the men who'd leered at her on the auction platform. Jonas was in the barn, and Alara was about to call for him when the lead rider, a man in his 40s with cruel eyes and expensive tact, spoke up. "Well, well, must be the girl Hale bought. Prettier than I expected, even with that bruise." Alara's hand went instinctively to her jaw, where the yellow-green had finally faded almost completely. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Vance Ketter. The leader touched his hat brim in a gesture that was more mockery than courtesy. "I run cattle in these parts. Just wanted to welcome Hale's new housekeeper to the valley." The pause before housekeeper was deliberate and insulting. Alara kept her expression neutral. "That's kind of you. I'll let Mr. Hale know you stopped by." "Oh, I'd like to speak with Hale myself." Ketter swung down from his horse, his companions following suit. "Man to man, you understand. Why don't you run along inside like a good girl?" Alara stood her ground. "Mr. Hale is working. I'm sure he'll call on you when he has time." Something dangerous flickered in Ketter's eye. "Now that's not very friendly. We're neighbors, after all. Neighbors look out for each other, make sure everyone's safe." Before Alara could respond, Jonas's voice cut through the tension. "State your business, Ketter." He'd emerged from the barn, and though he held no weapon, there was something in his bearing that made all 3 visitors tense. Jonas looked at Ketter, then at Alara, assessing the situation instantly. "Just being neighborly," Ketter said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Heard you'd taken in a woman. Wanted to make sure she was being treated properly. She's fine. Now get off my land. No need to be hostile, Hale. I'm just saying, a woman alone out here with a bachelor, people talk. And some of those people might wonder if she's here of her own free will, or if maybe she needs rescuing. Jonas's expression didn't change, but Alara saw his hands curl into fists. Alara came here of her own choice and stays of her own choice. Anyone who says different will answer to me. Big words for a man on his own. Ketter's smile widened. You've been out here 3 years, Hale, and you've made it clear you don't want to play nice with the rest of us. That's fine, but now you've got something men might want. And being so isolated, accidents happen. The threat was unmistakable. Jonas took a step forward, and though Ketter had 2 men backing him up, it was Ketter who retreated slightly. Get off my land. Jonas's voice was soft, but there was something lethal underneath it. Something that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd faced down dangerous men. Ketter held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, we're going. But you think about what I said, Hale. This is hard country. Man needs friends to survive, and enemies. He let the sentence hang, then climbed back on his horse. As the 3 riders disappeared down the track, Alara released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Jonas stood motionless, watching until they were out of sight, then turned to her. You all right? I'm fine. Who was that? Trouble? Jonas moved toward the cabin, gesturing for her to follow. Vance Ketter runs the biggest spread in the valley, bought or bullied his way to it. He's been pushing me to sell since I got here, and he doesn't take no for an answer. Why does he want your land so badly? Water rights. My creek feeds into the river that waters his entire northern pasture. If he controlled my land, he'd control the whole valley's water supply. Jonas began checking the rifle, loading it with practiced efficiency. I should have known he'd use you as leverage eventually. Guilt twisted in Alara's stomach. I'm making things worse for you. No. Jonas set the rifle aside and looked at her directly. Ketter was always going to be a problem. He's just using you as an excuse. But Alara, things might get dangerous. You want to leave? Go back to town. I'll understand. I'll give you money enough to get wherever you want to go. Alara thought about it. Really thought about it. She could leave. Go back to St. Louis with her tail between her legs. Find another situation as a housemaid or a shop girl. Live a small, safe life. But this valley, this cabin, this hard life alongside this complicated man, it felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. More honest, more worth fighting for. I'm not leaving, she said firmly. Not unless you want me gone. Something like relief flickered across Jonas's face. I don't want you gone. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, the thread of Vance Ketter hanging between them, and made a silent pact. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The storm was building, both literal and figurative. But for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach with Michael Chandler's false promises ringing in her ears, Alara Wynn felt like she was standing on solid ground, and she would fight like hell to keep it. The first snow came early that year, dusting the valley in white 2 weeks after Ketter's visit. Alara woke to find Jonas already up, standing at the window with his coffee, watching the flakes drift down through the pre-dawn darkness. Beautiful, isn't it? She said softly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't turn. Beautiful and dangerous. Early snow means a hard winter. We've got a month, maybe 6 weeks, to finish preparations before the real storms hit. They'd been working frantically since Ketter's threat, not just preparing for winter, but fortifying the ranch against more immediate dangers. Jonas had ridden to each of their 3 closest neighbors, all small-time ranchers like himself, who had no love for Ketter's bullying tactic, and quietly established a mutual aid agreement. If any of them saw riders approaching another's property, they'd fire warning shots. It wasn't much, but it was something. Alara had spent those 2 weeks transforming the cabin from a bachelor's sparse quarters into something that felt more like a home. She'd sewn curtains from fabric Jonas brought back from town, had organized the pantry with military precision, had even convinced him to let her plant a small herb garden in tin cans along the windowsill. Rosemary, sage, thyme, hardy plants that would survive indoors through the winter and make their simple meals taste less like survival and more like living. "I need to ride up to the high pasture today," Jonas said, still watching the snow. "Bring the cattle down before the passes close. It's a 2-day trip, maybe 3 if the weather turns." Alara felt her stomach clench. "You're leaving me alone?" "No." He finally turned to look at her, and she saw the conflict in his expression. "I'm taking you with me." "Is that wise? If Ketter's watching, I'm not leaving you here undefended." Jonas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "I can teach you to shoot, but I can't teach you to hold off 3 armed men by yourself. And I won't come back to find..." He stopped, his jaw working. "You're coming with me. That's final." There was something in his voice that told Alara this wasn't just about Ketter. There was old pain there, old fear, something that made the idea of leaving her alone intolerable to him. She didn't push. Everyone carried ghosts out here. "All right," she said. "I'll need to pack supplies." Relief flickered across his face. "Pack warm. It'll be cold up there, and we'll be sleeping rough." They left an hour after sunrise, leaving a pack horse loaded with supplies and camping gear. The trail climbed steadily into the mountains, following the creek up through stands of ponderosa pine and aspen. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped, and Alara was grateful for the heavy wool coat Jonas had insisted she wear. Another purchase from his last town trip, another small kindness he'd offered without fanfare. They rode in companionable silence for most of the morning, Jonas occasionally pointing out landmarks or explaining the terrain. Alara was getting better in the saddle, her body remembering skills from her childhood on the farm, and she could see Jonas's subtle approval in the way he no longer checked back on her every few minutes. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hardtack. They were high enough now that the valley spread below them needed painting. The cabin just a tiny speck beside the silver thread of the creek. The meadows already browning as winter approached. The mountains rising purple and magnificent on all sides. "It's like being on top of the world," Alara breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. Jonas watched her instead of the view. "You're not scared up here? Some people don't like the heights." "No, I feel..." She searched for the right word. "Free. Like all the small, petty things that seem so important down there don't matter up here." "That's why I came to Montana," Jonas said quietly. "To get away from all those small, petty things. To find somewhere big enough that my mistakes couldn't follow me." It was the most personal thing he'd said since that night she'd waited for him with the rifle. Alara turned to face him fully. "What mistakes, Jonas?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I was married once. Long time ago, back in Kansas. Her name was Sarah. She was..." He stopped, his throat working. "She was everything good, and I didn't deserve her. But she married me anyway, and for 3 years I thought maybe I could be the man she believed I was." Alara's heart ached at the past tense, at the rawness in his voice. "What happened?" "Raiders. During the war, though they weren't really fighting for any cause except their own greed. They came through our county burning and looting. I was out checking the stock when I heard the shots. By the time I got back..." His hands clenched on his knees. She'd barricaded herself in the cellar, held them off for as long as she could. But there were 6 of them and 1 of her. "Jonas, I'm so sorry." "I tracked them for 3 months, found them holed up in a mining camp in Colorado. The law wouldn't touch them. Times were too chaotic, too many scores being settled, too many men with blood on their hands. So I..." He met her eyes, and she saw something dark and final there. "I handled it myself, all 6 of them. Then I took the money I had left, came to Montana, and tried to build something where the past couldn't reach me." Alara understood now. Understood the isolation, the wariness, the walls he'd built around himself. "That's why you bid on me. You saw her in my eyes." "No." Jonas shook his head firmly. "I saw you. Someone fighting to survive, fighting to keep some dignity in a world that wanted to strip it away. Same fight Sarah had, but you're not her. You're different." "How?" He looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the conversation. "You're still here, still fighting. Sarah gave up at the end, and I can't blame her for that. But you, even after everything you've been through, you keep getting up. That takes a different kind of strength." They sat in silence for a while, the wind whispering through the pines, the horses cropping at the thin mountain grass. Finally, Alara said, "Thank you for telling me. And Jonas? You did deserve her. Men who don't deserve good women don't spend 3 months hunting down their killers. They don't build isolated ranches and rescue desperate women at auctions. They don't—" "I bought you for $10, Jonas interrupted harshly. "That's not rescue. That's just— I don't know what that is." "It's rescue," Alara insisted. "Whatever you want to call it, whatever complicated reasons you had, you stood between me and grind. You gave me a place where I don't have to be afraid every moment. You treat me like a person, not property. That's rescue, Jonas Hale, whether you're comfortable admitting it or not." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, something more complicated that neither was ready to name. Then Jonas stood abruptly, breaking the moment. "We should keep moving. Want to reach the high pasture before dark." They rode on, the trail growing steeper and rougher. By late afternoon, they'd reached the high pasture, a natural meadow sheltered by ridges on 3 sides, where Jonas kept his cattle during the summer months to take advantage of the rich mountain grass. The herd was scattered across the meadow, 30 head of mixed breeds that represented Jonas's entire fortune and future. "We'll camp here tonight," Jonas said, dismounting near a rocky outcrop that would provide some shelter. "Start driving them down at first light." They worked together to set up camp, hobbling the horses, gathering firewood, spreading bedroll. Jonas had brought a canvas tarp that they rigged as a lean-to against the rocks, creating a small protected space. It was crude, but it would keep off the worst of the wind and any snow that might fall overnight. As darkness settled over the mountains, they huddled close to the fire, eating beans heated in a tin pot and drinking coffee that tasted like smoke and wilderness. The stars came out in impossible profusion, so thick and bright they cast actual shadows, and Alara found herself staring up in wonder. "I never saw stars like this in St. Louis," she murmured. "Never knew there were so many." "Light from the city drowns them out," Jonas said. "Out here you can see all the way to infinity. Makes you realize how small you are. Or how big the world is." Alara pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "How many possibilities there are beyond the small corners we usually inhabit." Jonas smiled, one of those rare, fleeting expressions that transformed his whole face. "You've got a poet's soul hiding under that practical exterior." "My mother used to read poetry, Wordsworth mostly. She loved the ones about nature, about finding divinity in the everyday world." Alara surprised herself by continuing. "After she died, I tried to read them, but they just made me sad. All that beauty she'd never see again." "Maybe she sees it differently now," Jonas offered quietly. "Maybe death isn't an ending, but a different kind of scene." "You believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore, but I'd like to think Sarah's somewhere she can't be hurt, that she's at peace, even if I'm not." They fell silent, both lost in their own memories of the dead, the fire crackling between them like a living thing. The cattle lowed softly in the darkness, and somewhere far off a wolf howled, a sound echoing off the mountainsides. "Jonas?" Alara said eventually. "Why didn't you remarry? After Sarah, I mean. It's been, 10 years?" 11. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up sparks. "At first I was too angry, too focused on revenge. Then I was too numb, and then—" He shrugged. "Then I was too used to being alone. It seems safer that way. Can't lose what you don't have. That's not living, though. That's just surviving." Says the woman who came west to escape her aunt's parlor, Jonas countered. "But there was no heat in it." "Exactly. I'm an expert in just surviving, and I can tell you it's a miserable way to exist." Alara leaned forward, her face earnest in the firelight. "These past 2 months at your ranch, working myself to exhaustion, eating simple food, sleeping on a floor behind a canvas curtain, it's been more alive than I've felt in 8 years, because I'm doing something that matters, because I'm not alone in it." Jonas met her eyes across the flames. "You're not alone," he agreed softly. "Neither of us is. Not anymore." The moment stretched between them, weighted with things neither was ready to say aloud. Then Jonas cleared his throat and stood. I'll check the horses one more time. You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be hard work." Elara nodded and retreated to the lean-to, wrapping herself in her bedroll while Jonas moved through the darkness, checking on their animals with quiet efficiency. When he finally returned and settled into his own bedroll several feet away from hers, maintaining that careful distance he always kept, she was still awake. "Jonas?" she whispered into the darkness. "Yeah? Thank you for bringing me up here, for trusting me with your story. Thank you for listening, for not looking at me different after. You did what you had to do. Anyone who judges you for that has never loved someone enough to understand." She heard him shift in his bedroll, heard his breath catch. "Good night, Elara." "Good night, Jonas." Sleep came slowly, but when it did, Elara dreamed of stars and mountains and a future that might, impossibly, include something more than just survival. They woke before dawn to find a light dusting of snow covering everything. Jonas was immediately alert, assessing the weather with the practiced eye of someone who knew how quickly mountain conditions could turn deadly. "We need to move fast," he said, already rolling up his bedroll. "There's more coming." They broke camp in record time, eating a hasty breakfast of jerky and cold coffee while Jonas explained the plan. They'd drive the herd down the mountain in two groups. He'd take the lead with the dominant cattle, she'd bring up the rear, making sure none of the stragglers got left behind. It was hard, dangerous work, but Jonas showed no hesitation in trusting her with it. "If anything goes wrong, if the weather turns bad, you leave the cattle and head down," he instructed firmly. "The herd's not worth your life. You understand?" "I understand." But Elara knew she wouldn't abandon the cattle unless she absolutely had to. This herd was Jonas's livelihood, his entire future. She'd see them safely down if it killed her. The drive began smoothly enough. The cattle, fattened on summer grass and docile from the cold, moved down the trail with minimal urging. But as the morning wore on, the snow began falling harder, and the temperature dropped until Elara's fingers were numb inside her gloves, and her face stung from the wind-driven ice. They were halfway down, navigating a particularly treacherous stretch of trail where the path narrowed between two steep drop-offs when disaster struck. One of the older cows, spooked by something Elara couldn't see, suddenly bolted sideways, knocking into two others. The cattle panicked, their eyes rolling white, and suddenly half the herd was stampeding back up the trail toward Elara. "Get out of the way!" Jonas's voice cut through the wind, but Elara was already moving, urging her horse sideways onto a small ledge as the cattle thundered past. For a terrifying moment, she thought they'd all go over the edge, taking her with them. But then Jonas appeared on his horse above the melee, firing his pistol into the air and shouting in a voice that somehow cut through the panic. The cattle slowed, milling in confusion, and Jonas expertly turned them back down the trail. The three had broken away, heading up a side canyon, and Elara saw Jonas's face tighten with frustration. They couldn't afford to lose even 3 head. "I'll get them!" she shouted, already turning her horse. "Elara, no! It's too dangerous!" But she was already gone, following the tracks into the narrow canyon. It was stupid, reckless, exactly the kind of thing Jonas had warned her not to do. But she'd seen the calculations running behind his eyes, the grim arithmetic of survival that said 3 head of cattle might make the difference between making it through winter and going under. She wouldn't let him lose them. The canyon narrowed as she climbed, the walls pressing in until she could barely see sky above. The tracks were clear in the fresh snow, 3 sets leading deeper into the mountain. Elara followed grimly, her horse picking its way over increasingly rough terrain. She found them 10 minutes later, huddled together in a box canyon with no exit except the way she'd come in. Getting them back out would be tricky, but not impossible. Elara dismounted and began the careful work of turning them around, speaking in a low, soothing voice that her father had taught her years ago. "Easy now. Nobody's gonna hurt you. We're just going home, back down to the warm valley. Easy." It was working. The cattle were calming, beginning to move back toward the canyon entrance. Elara was just congratulating herself on a job well done when she heard the sound. A low, rumbling growl that made every hair on her body stand up. She turned slowly and saw it. A mountain lion, crouched on a ledge 15 feet above her, its amber eyes fixed not on the cattle, but on her. It was lean, probably hungry this late in the season, and she was between it and its potential meal. Alara's mind raced. The rifle was on her horse 30 feet away. Moving toward it would trigger the cat's chase instinct. Standing still might work, or might just prolong the inevitable. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The lion's hindquarters bunched, preparing to spring. And then a shot rang out, kicking up rock inches from the cat's paw. The animal yowled and leaped backward, disappearing over the ridge as Jonas came thundering into the canyon on his horse, rifle raised, his face white with fear and fury. "What the hell were you thinking?" he shouted, swinging down from his horse almost before it stopped moving. "I told you not to. I told you." His voice cracked, and suddenly he was gripping her shoulders, his hands shaking. "Do you have any idea what could have happened?" "I'm fine," Alara said, though she was shaking too. "I'm fine, Jonas. You got here in time." "Barely." He pulled her against him, a brief fierce embrace that was over almost before it began. But in that moment, Alara felt the full force of his fear, his relief, his anger at her recklessness, and at himself for caring so much. "Don't ever do that again. Nothing is worth your life. Not the cattle, not the ranch, nothing. You hear me?" "I hear you." She stepped back, trying to steady her breathing. "But Jonas, we got them. All three." He looked at her for a long moment, torn between residual terror and reluctant admiration. Finally, he shook his head. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish." "Maybe both." "Yeah." His mouth quirked in something almost like a smile. "Maybe both. Come on, let's get these stubborn animals down the mountain before anything else tries to kill us." They made it back to the ranch 2 days later, exhausted and frozen, but with all 30 head of cattle accounted for. The valley felt like a haven after the exposed mountain heights, and Alara nearly wept with relief when she saw the cabin's familiar silhouette against the darkening sky. Jonas saw to the cattle while Alara stumbled inside and got a fire going, her hands so numb she could barely strike the match. By the time Jonas came in, she had coffee brewing and was thawing out in front of the stove, still wearing her coat because she didn't have the energy to take it off. Jonas poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, then sank into his chair with a groan of exhaustion. They sat in silence for a while, too tired for conversation, just grateful to be home and alive. Finally, Jonas said, "That was stupid, going after those cattle alone." "I know. You could have died." "I know. If that cat had jumped before I got there." "But it didn't." Alara set down her coffee and looked at him. "Jonas, I understand the risks. I do. But this ranch, this life, it's worth fighting for, worth taking risks for. You taught me that. I never told you to risk your life for a few cattle. No, you just showed me every day what it means to build something, to fight for something, even when the odds are terrible and the work is hard. You showed me what it means to not give up." She leaned forward, her voice intense. "Do you know what my life was before you? Sitting in my aunt's parlor, making polite conversation, slowly suffocating under the weight of all those expectations and judgments. Then Michael, and that nightmare. And then the auction, where I was about to be sold to a man who would have destroyed what was left of me. Alara, you gave me a different life, Jonas. One where I matter, where my work means something, where I can go to sleep tired instead of numb. So yes, I chased those cattle. And yes, I'd do it again. Because this place, this life we're building, it's worth it." Jonas stared at her, something complicated working behind his eyes. "We," he finally said. "You said we're building." Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Well, aren't we? I know I'm hired help, technically, but you're not hired help." Jonas set down his coffee and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Haven't been for a while now, and we both know it. He struggled with the words. "You're a partner. In the ranch, and the work, and everything. And that scares the hell out of me." "Why?" "Because I already lost one partner, one person I cared about, and it nearly destroyed me." His voice dropped. "I can't go through that again, Alara. I can't let myself care that much, and then what? Spend the rest of your life alone just to avoid the possibility of pain?" Alara moved to kneel in front of his chair, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Jonas, I lost my parents. I lost my home, my innocence, my faith in people. And yes, It hurt. It still hurts. But I'd rather live with that pain and keep trying than lock myself away and call it safety. Jonas reached out slowly, his hand hovering near her face, then finally, gently, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You're braver than I am. No, I'm just tired of being afraid. They stayed like that, frozen in the moment, the fire crackling and the wind howling outside and something huge and terrifying and wonderful building between them. Jonas's hand lingered against her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Laura, he said hoarsely, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to... A gunshot cracked through the night, shattering the moment. Then another, and another. Warning shots from the neighbor to the east, the signal they'd agreed on. Riders approaching. Jonas was on his feet instantly, grabbing the rifle from above the fireplace while Alara doused the lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness. Through the window, they could see shapes moving in the moonlight. 4, maybe 5 riders, approaching slowly, deliberately. Keter, Jonas said grimly. Has to be. Stay away from the windows. But Alara had already grabbed the shotgun Jonas had taught her to use, checking the load with steady hands. If they're here for trouble, they'll get more than they bargained for. Jonas looked at her, really looked at her, and something like pride flickered across his face. That mountain lion should have been warning enough. A woman like you is dangerous. You have no idea, Alara said, and positioned herself by the side window where she'd have a clear field of fire. The rider stopped about 50 yards out, just within shouting distance. A voice called out, Ketter's voice, arrogant and mocking. Hail, we need to talk. Jonas opened the door slightly, his rifle visible. So talk, but keep your hands where I can see them. You're making enemies, Hale, important enemies, men with long memories. Keter was barely a silhouette in the darkness, but his voice carried clear. That woman of yours, words going around she's not exactly proper, that maybe she's here against her will, that maybe we should rescue her from your hospitality. The only thing Alara needs rescuing from is your unwanted attention, Jonas called back. And if you or your men set one foot on this property, you'll find out exactly how unwelcoming I can be. Big words for one man. He's not alone. Alara stepped into the doorway beside Jonas, the shotgun cradled confidently in her arms. And I'm a better shot than you might think. There was a moment of surprised silence from the darkness. Then Keter laughed, but it sounded forced. So the girl has teeth. That's interesting. But you're still outnumbered and winter's coming on. Long, cold winter. A lot of things can happen when people are isolated. Supplies get lost. Cabins catch fire. Accidents happen. Are you threatening us? Jonas's voice had gone cold and flat. The voice of a man who'd tracked 6 raiders across 2 territories and meted out justice with his own hands. I'm just stating fact. But maybe we can come to an arrangement. You sign over your water rights, I make sure nothing unfortunate happens to you or your pretty housekeeper. Everybody wins. Get off my land, Jonas said softly. Right now. Before this goes somewhere nobody wants it to go. For a long moment, the standoff held. Then Keter spoke again, and this time there was real menace in his voice. You're making a mistake, Hale. Both of you. Remember that. When the winter gets hard and you're alone up here with nobody to help you. The riders turned and disappeared into the darkness, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Jonas didn't move from the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Then he closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it with his eyes closed. This is my fault, he said. I brought you into this, put you in danger. Stop! Alara set down the shotgun and crossed to him. I chose this. I chose to stay when you offered me the chance to leave. And I'm choosing to stay now, even knowing what Keter might do. This is my fight too, Jonas. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and she saw the war raging behind them. The desire to protect her versus the knowledge that she had every right to choose her own battles. Finally, he nodded. All right, but we do this smart. We fortify, we stay alert, and we don't give Keter any opening. Agreed. They spent the next hour securing the cabin, checking weapons, planning defenses. And when they finally collapsed into their respective sleeping areas, Alara behind her canvas curtain, Jonas on his bedroll by the fire, Both lay awake in the darkness, listening for riders that didn't come, but knowing they would eventually. The storm was building, just as Jonas had predicted. But it wasn't just weather anymore. It was something darker, more dangerous, and it was heading straight for their isolated valley. And somewhere in the growing tension, in the space between fear and defiance, the thing that had been building between them was changing too. From friendship to partnership to something deeper. Something neither could deny anymore, even if neither was quite ready to name it. Morning would bring new challenges, new dangers, but tonight at least they were together. And that was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Even if neither of them had quite worked up the courage to say it aloud yet, the winter settled over the valley like a siege. Each snowfall, another layer of isolation between the ranch and the outside world. For 3 weeks after Ketter's midnight visit, nothing happened. No riders appeared on the horizon, no threatening messages arrived. But the silence felt wrong, stretched too tight, like the moment before lightning strike. Jonas worked himself to exhaustion during those weeks, as if constant motion could keep the danger at bay. He reinforced the barn doors, built shutters for the cabin windows that could be barred from inside, stocked extra ammunition, and rode the fence line every other day looking for signs of intrusion. Alara watched him wearing himself down and said nothing, understanding that this was how he dealt with fear, by trying to control everything he could. She dealt with it differently. While Jonas fortified the exterior, Alara transformed the interior, preparing for a siege of a different kind. She preserved everything from their autumn harvest, filling the root cellar with jars of pickled vegetables, smoked meat, dried herbs. She sewed warmer clothes from fabric Jonas had stockpiled, mended every piece of equipment in the cabin, and established routines that gave structure to the uncertain days. If they were going to face whatever Ketter threw at them, they'd do it with full bellies and warm backs. Their evenings by the fire had changed since that interrupted moment 3 weeks ago. The conversations were still there, still easy, but underneath ran a current of unspoken awareness. Jonas's careful distances had become less careful. Sometimes his hand would brush hers when passing the coffee pot. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. But neither pushed, both understanding that whatever was building between them needed time, needed safety, needed a world that wasn't balanced on the edge of violence. On a gray afternoon in late November, that world finally tipped over the edge. Alara was in the barn tending the horses when she heard Jonas's shout from the corral. She grabbed the rifle they now kept loaded near the door and ran outside to find him standing rigid, staring at something in the snow. "What is it?" Jonas pointed without speaking. There, arranged in a neat line just inside the fence, were 3 dead chickens. Their necks had been wrung, and they'd been positioned deliberately, unmistakably. A message written in blood and feathers. "When did this happen?" Alara's voice was steady despite the ice spreading through her veins. "Sometime last night. I checked this morning and they weren't here." Jonas's jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping. "He's telling us he can get to us whenever he wants, that our defenses don't matter. Or he's trying to scare us into making a mistake." Alara forced herself to think tactically, the way her father had taught her during the war years when raiders were a constant threat. "He wants us panicked, wants us to either run or do something stupid that gives him an excuse to escalate." Jonas turned to look at her, something like surprise in his expression. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before." "My father's farm was in Missouri, right on the border. We had both sides coming through, both sides taking what they wanted and calling it patriotism. The memories were bitter, but useful. He taught me that bullies feed on fear. The moment you show it, they win. So what do? We bury the chickens, we strengthen the coop, and we show Ketter that we're not running." Alara met his eyes steadily. "But Jonas, we need to be smart about this. He's waiting for you to ride over there with your rifle. That's what he wants. A confrontation he can spin as self-defense." Jonas nodded slowly, his analytical mind working through the angles. "You're right, but I can't just let this stand. If I do nothing, the neighbors will think I'm weak, and Ketter will push harder. So we do something public, visible. We ride into town tomorrow, both of us, and we make sure everyone sees us. We buy supplies, we talk to people, we show we're not hiding. And if anyone asks about trouble, we tell them the truth. The Ketter's trying to intimidate us off our land, and we're not going anywhere." A slow smile spread across Jonas's face. You'd have made a hell of a general. My father always said I had a strategic mind. My aunt tried to train it out of me, said it wasn't feminine to think about such things. Alara's voice hardened. But out here, those instincts are what keep people alive. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the town trip, cleaning weapons, checking the cabin's security, leaving everything ready in case they came back to find trouble. That night, Jonas slept with his boots on and the rifle beside his bedroll, and Alara lay awake behind her canvas curtain, listening to every creak and whisper of the settling cabin. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of crystalline winter day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. They rode out together, Jonas on his dun gelding and Alara on the smaller mare he'd trained for her use. The town was a 2-hour ride, and they spent it in comfortable silence, both alert for any sign of Ketter's men. Benton's crossing looked different in winter, smaller, harder, more desperate. The false-fronted buildings seemed to huddle together against the cold, and the few people on the street moved quickly, heads down, focused on survival rather than sociability. But when Jonas and Alara hitched their horses outside the general store, Alara saw curtains twitch in nearby windows, saw faces turn to watch. The auction girl and the hermit rancher. They'd be gossip fodder for weeks. Inside the store, the proprietor, a heavy-set man named Larson with shrewd eyes and careful manners, greeted them with studied neutrality. "Hail, Miss Wynn. What can I do for you folks?" Jonas handed over a list. "Need these supplies. Can you have them ready in an hour?" Larson scanned the list and nodded. "Most of it's in stock. Coffee might be a problem. Short supply this winter, but I can probably find you a couple pounds." "Appreciate it." Jonas counted out money onto the counter. "Heard any news from the valley?" It was a careful question, the kind that invited information without asking directly. Larson's eyes flickered between them, weighing how much to say. Finally, he leaned in slightly. "Heard Ketter's been telling folks you've got claim trouble, that your water rights aren't clear." "My water rights are crystal clear, filed properly, witnessed, registered with the territorial office." Jonas's voice was loud, hard. "If Ketter's spreading different stories, he's lying." "Just telling you what I heard." Larson straightened, his tone carefully neutral. "None of my business, really, but you might want to talk to folks yourself, set the record straight. A lot of people in town who don't much care for Ketter's methods, but they're not going to stand up for someone who won't stand up for themselves." It was good advice, and Jonas knew it. He nodded. "We'll do that." "Thanks, Larson." They spent the next hour making the rounds. The livery, the blacksmith, the saloon where Jonas wasn't known to drink, but which served as the town's unofficial information center. At each stop, Jonas made their position clear. The ranch was his, legally and completely, and he wasn't selling or leaving. And at each stop, Alara stood beside him, not quite touching, but clearly unified, making it equally clear that she wasn't some victim in need of rescue, but a partner in every sense that mattered. The responses varied. Some people were sympathetic, offering quiet support and promises to keep an eye out. Others were non-committal, clearly unwilling to take sides in a fight that didn't directly concern them. But what mattered was that the truth was out there now, competing with whatever lies Ketter had been spreading. They were leaving the blacksmith's forge when a voice cut through the afternoon chill. "Well, if it isn't Hale and his bought woman." Alara turned to see Grimes, the saloon owner who'd bid $5 for her at the auction. He stood on the saloon's front porch, a whiskey glass in one hand and a sneer on his face. Two of his girls flanked him, shivering in their thin dresses, their painted faces looking garish in the harsh winter light. Jonas stiffened beside her, but Alara put a hand on his arm. "Ignore him. He's trying to provoke a fight." "Ignore me?" Grimes's voice rose, drawing attention from the few people still on the street. "That's rich coming from a woman who should be working for me right now. Hale stole you fair and square from that auction." "Nobody stole anybody." Alara's voice cut through his bluster like a blade. "Mr. Hale offered me honest work and fair treatment. You offered me degradation and an early grave. If you can't tell the difference, that says more about you than it does about me." A few onlookers chuckled at that, and Grimes's face darkened. "You think you're better than my girls? You think spreading your legs for one man instead of many makes you respectable?" Jonas moved then, faster than Alara had ever seen him move. crossing the distance to Grimes in 3 long strides. He didn't touch the man, but his presence, tall, coiled, dangerous, made Grimes take an involuntary step backward. "You ever speak about her like that again," Jonas said softly, "and I'll break every bone in your face. That's not a threat. That's a promise." The street had gone silent. Even the horses seemed to be holding their breath. Grimes's hand moved toward his coat, where he probably kept a derringer, but then another voice interrupted. "I'd think twice about that if I were you, Grimes." Sheriff Tom Booker stepped out of his office across the street, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He was an older man, gray-bearded and weathered, with the kind of quiet authority that came from having seen everything twice and learned not to be impressed by blustering fools. "This is a private conversation, Sheriff," Grimes blustered. "Nothing private about standing on a public street insulting a lady." Booker's tone was mild, but his eyes were hard. "And I'm pretty sure Hale here was just about to walk away. Weren't you, Hale?" Jonas held Grimes's gaze for one more long moment, then nodded. "Yeah, we're done here." He turned and walked back to Alara, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. They crossed to where the sheriff stood, and Booker tipped his hat to Alara. "Miss Wynn, good to see you looking well." "Sheriff," Alara appreciated that he called her by name, treating her with respect that Grimes never would. Booker shifted his attention to Jonas. "Heard you've been having trouble out at your place. Want to make an official report?" Jonas considered this. An official report would put Ketter's harassment on record, but it would also escalate things in ways that might not be helpful. "Not yet, but if anything happens, if someone gets hurt or property gets damaged, I want it known that there's been a pattern." "Fair enough. I'll make a note." Booker's expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, Hale, you've got friends in this town. Not everybody's in Ketter's pocket. You need help. You send word." "Appreciate that, Sheriff." They collected their supplies from Larson and headed out of town, both aware of the eyes watching them go. They'd made their stand, publicly and clearly. Now they'd see what Ketter's response would be. They were an hour from home, riding through a narrow section of trail flanked by thick pine forest, when Alara's horse suddenly shied, nearly throwing her. Jonas reined in immediately, his hand going to his rifle. "What spooked her?" "I don't know. She just..." Alara stopped, her eyes going to something glinting in the snow ahead. "Jonas, look." Stretched across the trail at horse-chest height was a wire, nearly invisible against the white background. If Alara's mare hadn't spooked, if they'd been riding a little faster, it would have caught them full across the throat or chest, likely killing them both. Jonas dismounted carefully, examining the wire without touching it. "Someone strung this recently. Snow's fresh underneath, which means it went up this morning while we were in town. Ketter knew we'd be coming back this way." Alara's voice was steady, but Jonas could see her hands trembling on the rein. "This wasn't a warning. This was an attempt to kill us." "Yeah." Jonas carefully cut the wire down, coiling it and stowing it in his saddlebag as evidence. "And that changes everything." They rode the rest of the way home in tense silence, both scanning the forest for any sign of ambush, but if Ketter's men were watching, they stayed hidden. The cabin appeared undisturbed when they arrived, but Jonas insisted on checking every building, every shadow, before he'd let Alara go inside. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat at the table, the cabin dark except for the glow from the banked stove, and planned. "We can go to the sheriff," Alara said. "Show him the wire, tell him about the chickens. And Ketter will say anyone could have strung that wire, that we're making accusations without proof." Jonas rubbed his face wearily. Booker's sympathetic, but he's also practical. He's not going to arrest the most powerful rancher in the valley on circumstantial evidence. "Then what do we do?" Jonas looked at her across the table, and in the dim light his face looked older, harder. "We prepare for war. Real war, not just harassment. Because that wire wasn't a warning, Alara. It was a statement of intent. Ketter's decided we're not going to leave on our own, so he's going to make us leave. Or make sure we can't. The neighbors are too far away to help if things go bad quickly, and most of them have families to think about. They won't risk their own people for us." Jonas reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I need you to understand something. This could get very bad, very fast. And if you want to leave, if you want to go back to St. Louis or anywhere else, I'll give you money, arrange safe passage, whatever you need. I won't think less of you for it. Alara looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his calloused roughness and her work-worn fingers, and felt something settle in her chest. Do you want me to leave? God, no. The words burst out of him. But what I want doesn't matter. Your safety, my safety is my decision. She squeezed his hand. Jonas, I know what I'm choosing. I know the risks, and I'm staying. Why? His voice was raw. Why risk everything for a ranch you don't own, for a life you didn't ask for? Because it's not about the ranch. Alara stood, moving around the table until she was standing beside his chair. It's about you, about us, about the life we've been building together, even if we've been too careful to say it out loud. Jonas looked up at her, and in the dimness she could see the war in his eye. Fear and hope and desperate longing all tangled together. Alara, I can't promise you safety. I can't promise you anything except that I'll fight like hell to protect you. That's enough. She cupped his face in her hands, feeling the scratch of his stubble, the warmth of his skin. That's more than enough. He stood slowly, his hands coming to rest on her waist, and for a long moment they simply stood there, breathing the same air, balanced on the edge of something neither could take back. Then Jonas leaned down, his forehead touching hers, and whispered, "If something happens to you because of me, then we'll face it together." Alara tilted her head up, closing the last small distance between them. No more alone, Jonas. Not for either of us. The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, tentative, almost questioning, as if they were both testing whether this was real or just another dream that would dissolve in the harsh light of morning. But then Jonas's arms tightened around her, and Alara's hands fisted in his shirt, and the gentleness gave way to something more urgent, more necessary. 11 years of loneliness and 3 months of slowly building connection, pouring out in a single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against hers again. "I love you," he said hoarsely. "God help me. I didn't want to, but I do. I love you, Alara Wynn. I love you too." The words felt right, felt true, felt like coming home after a long and terrible journey. "And we're going to survive this, Jonas. We're going to fight, and we're going to win, and we're going to build the life we both deserve." "Survival isn't living," Jonas said, echoing her words from months ago. "No," Alara smiled, fierce and certain. "But loving you, that's living. That's worth everything." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the darkness, drawing strength from their connection. And when they finally separated to get what little sleep they could, it was with the understanding that everything had changed. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting for a future, together. The attack came 2 nights later, in the dead hours before dawn when exhaustion was deepest and reflexes slowest. Alara woke to Jonas's hand over her mouth and his lips against her ear. "Smoke, stay low and stay quiet." She was instantly alert, her heart hammering. Through the window, she could see an orange glow coming from the direction of the barn. The barn, where their horses were, where their winter feed was stored, where their entire survival depended. Jonas was already moving, grabbing his rifle and checking the load. "They're trying to burn us out, probably hoping we'll run outside, make easy targets." "How many?" "At least 4, maybe more." He handed her the shotgun. "Stay here, bar the door behind me. If anyone tries to come through, shoot first and apologize never." "Jonas, you can't go out there alone. The horses, Alara. If they burn, we lose everything. We won't make it through the winter." His face was grim in the flickering light from outside. "I have to try." He kissed her once, hard and desperate, then was gone into the night. Alara barred the doors instructed, then took up position at the window, the shotgun ready. Through the glass, she could see figures moving near the barn, at least 3 of them, and flames were already licking up the far wall. Jonas emerged from the shadows, moving low and fast, and fired once. A man screamed and went down. 2 more shots rang out from different directions, not Jonas's rifle, and she saw him dive behind the water trough. He was pinned down, unable to reach the barn, unable to get the horses out. The flames were spreading, and she could hear the animals' panicked whinnying. Alara made a decision. She unbarred the door, grabbed the shotgun, and ran. The cold hit her like a fist, stealing her breath, but she ignored it. She could see the barn doors now, could see that they'd been barred from outside. A deliberate cruelty to ensure the horses burned. She fired the shotgun in the general direction of where she'd seen muzzle flashes, not really aiming, just trying to buy Jonas time. "Alara, get back inside!" Jonas's voice was raw with fear, but she was already at the barn doors, struggling with the bar. It was heavy, designed to keep determined cattle in, and her hands were numb with cold and fear. Behind her, she heard running footsteps and spun around, raising the empty shotgun like a club. The man charging her was one of Ketter's. She recognized him from the midnight visit. He had a knife, and his face was twisted with ugly intent. Alara swung the shotgun with all her strength, catching him across the temple. He went down hard, but two more were coming, and she'd just used her only weapon as a club. Then Jonas was there, materializing out of the darkness like an avenging spirit. His fist connected with the first man's jaw with a crack that echoed across the valley, and he had his rifle barrel pressed to the second man's throat before the man could raise his gun. "Drop it, or I'll crush your windpipe." The gun clattered to the snow. Jonas shoved the man backward, then turned to help Alara with the barn door. Together they lifted the heavy bar and threw the doors open. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking, but through it came their horses, terrified and wild-eyed, but alive. "Get them to the corral!" Jonas shouted over the roar of the flames. "I'll get water!" But before either could move, a voice cut through the chaos. "Everybody freeze!" Sheriff Booker stood at the edge of the firelight, his gun drawn, his deputies flanking him. And behind them, looking murderous, was Vance Ketter himself. "This is a misunderstanding, Sheriff," Ketter said smoothly. "My men and I were riding through when we saw the fire. We came to help. By barring the barn doors?" Alara's voice was shaking with rage and reaction. "By shooting at us when we tried to save our horses? I'm sure in the confusion, things got mixed up. Sheriff," Jonas's voice was deadly calm. "I shot one of Ketter's men. He's over there, bleeding. And that one," he pointed to the man Alara had hit with the shotgun, "tried to attack Miss Wynne with a knife. That's not confusion. That's attempted murder." Booker looked at Ketter, then at the burning barn, then at the three injured men. His face hardened. "Vance, I'm going to need you and your men to come to town with me. Answer some questions. Now see here, Tom. That's Sheriff Booker to you right now." Booker's voice had steel underneath it. "And unless you want to add resisting arrest to the charges, you'll mount up and ride peacefully." For a moment, Ketter looked like he might argue. Then his eyes swept over the scene. The smoking barn, the deputies with their weapons drawn, Jonas standing protective in front of Alara with a rifle that had already proven accurate, and he seemed to calculate the odds. "This isn't over, Hale," he said quietly. "Yeah, it is." Jonas didn't lower the rifle, "because next time I won't wait for the law. I'll handle it the way I handled things in Colorado." Something in his tone, in his eyes, made Ketter go pale. Whatever reputation Jonas had left behind, whatever he'd done to those 6 raiders, Ketter had just gotten a glimpse of it. He turned his horse without another word and rode off into the darkness, his men following under the deputy's watchful eyes. Booker lingered a moment longer. "You'll need to come to town tomorrow. Make a statement, both of you." "We'll be there," Jonas promised. "And Hale?" Booker's voice softened slightly. "Get that barn fire out before it spreads. And consider whether staying out here is worth dying for." He rode off, leaving Jonas and Alara standing in the cold dawn, the barn still smoking behind them, their horses scattered across the snow, and the reality of how close they'd come to death settling over them like a shroud. They worked until full daylight, saving what they could of the barn and their winter supplies. The damage was extensive but not total. The far wall was destroyed, some of the feed was ruined, but the structure was still standing and could be repaired. It could have been so much worse. When the immediate crisis was handled, they stumbled back to the cabin, exhausted and reeking of smoke. Alara's hands were blistered from fighting the fire, and Jonas had a cut across his ribs from where one of Ketter's men had gotten close with a knife. They cleaned and bandaged each other's wounds in silence, too tired for words. But when they finally collapsed together on Jonas's bed, no more pretense of separate sleeping areas, no more careful distance, Jonas pulled her close and buried his face in her hair. "When I saw you run out of that cabin," he said, his voice muffled, "when I saw you at those barn doors with that bastard charging at you, I know." Alara held him tighter. "I know. I felt the same when you went out there alone. But Jonas, we made it. We're alive. This time." He pulled back enough to look at her, and she saw tears tracking through the soot on his face. "Alara, I can't do this. I can't watch you risk your life for a piece of land. It's an animal. It's not worth it." "Yes, it is." She cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "This isn't just about land anymore. It's about not letting bullies win. It's about standing up for what's right. And it's about us, Jonas. Our life, our future. I won't let Keter take that from us. Even if it kills you? Even then." She kissed him softly. "Because a life lived afraid, a life spent running, that's not really living. You taught me that. You showed me what it means to fight for something, to build something worth having. I'm not going to abandon that now." Jonas closed his eyes and she felt him tremble. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good." Alara managed a tired smile. "Be terrified. Be afraid. But don't give up. Don't let them win." They lay there as the sun rose fully, warming the cabin, burning away the shadows. Outside, the valley was pristine and beautiful, the mountains standing eternal watch, the creek frozen into winter silence. It looked peaceful, but they both knew the truth now. The real battle was just beginning. And when it came, when Keter made his final move, they would face it together, standing side by side, refusing to bend or break or run. Because some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth dying for. And what they'd found in each other, in this hard land under these endless skies, was both. They rode into town 3 hours later, both hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, but determined to see this through. The sheriff's office was warm compared to the bitter cold outside, and Booker had coffee waiting, strong, bitter, but welcome. They took their statements separately, then together, his deputy scratching notes with a pencil worn down to a stub. "Ketter's claiming his men saw the fire and came to help," Booker said when they'd finished. "Says you two must have been confused in the chaos, mistook his rescue attempt for an attack." "That's horseshit and you know it," Jonas said flatly. "Those barn doors were barred from the outside. The horses would have burned alive if we hadn't gotten them out." "That's not an accident, Tom. That's deliberate." "I know what it is." Booker leaned back in his chair, looking every one of his 60-some years. "But knowing and proving are different things. The man you shot survived, barely, but he's claiming he was shot while trying to put out the fire. The one Miss Wynn hit with the shotgun says he was running to warn you about the blaze when you attacked him." "They're lying," Alara said, her voice tight with frustration. "Sheriff, you saw the scene. You know what happened." "What I know and what I can prove in front of a territorial judge are two different things." Booker pulled out a bottle from his desk drawer and poured a measure into his coffee. He didn't offer any to Jonas or Alara. "Here's the truth, plain as I can make it. Ketter's got money, influence, and half the valley either works for him or owes him favors. You've got righteous anger and not much else. If this goes to trial, you'll lose." Jonas's hands clenched into fists on the desk. "So he gets away with attempted murder? With trying to burn us out? I'm holding his men for a few days, see if any of them crack under pressure. Sometimes guilt gets the better of folks." Booker's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "But Vance himself? I can't touch him without proof. And you didn't see him near that barn. His lawyers would eat me alive." "This is wrong." Alara's voice shook, not with fear but with rage at the injustice of it. "You're telling us to go home and wait for him to try again? I'm telling you to be smart." Booker looked between them. "Ketter's used to getting what he wants. He's not going to stop until he has your land or you're gone. Now, I can't officially tell you to leave. That'd be letting him win. But I can tell you that staying might cost you your life." "You're not leaving," Jonas and Alara said in unison, then looked at each other with grim smiles. Booker shook his head. "Figured you'd say that." "All right then. Here's what I can do. I'll make it known around town that I'm watching the situation. I'll ride out to your place once a week, make sure you're still breathing, And if anything else happens, anything at all, you document it, you send word, and I'll come running. But beyond that, he spread his hands helplessly. I'm one man with 2 deputies trying to keep peace in a valley bigger than some eastern states. I can't guard you round the clock. We understand. Jonas stood, helping Alara to her feet. And Sheriff, thank you for coming when you did. If you hadn't shown up, don't think about it. Booker's expression was troubled. Just stay alert and stay alive. That's all I can ask. They left the office and stood on the boardwalk, watching the town go about its business, as if their world wasn't balanced on a knife's edge. Across the street, Grimes stood in front of his saloon, watching them with undisguised malice. 2 doors down, a woman Alara didn't recognize quickly looked away when their eyes met, as if association might be contagious. We need supplies, Jonas said quietly. Stuff to repair the barn, more ammunition, feed for the horses. But I don't like leaving you alone. Then we stay together. Alara took his hand openly, not caring who saw. Everything we do from now on, we do together. They made their rounds through town, and Alara felt the weight of eyes following them everywhere. Some looks were sympathetic, whispered words of encouragement given when no one else was listening. But others were cold, calculating, the looks of people already writing them off as yesterday's news, soon to be another cautionary tale about challenging the wrong man. At the general store, Larson was subdued, checking nervously over his shoulder as he filled their order. Heard about the trouble, he said in a low voice. Heard Ketter's telling folks you started that fire yourself, trying to frame him. That's a lie, Alara said sharply. I know it is. Most folks with sense know it too. Larson packaged their goods quickly, his movements nervous. But Vance has a way of making his lies the truth, if you take my meaning. He's got influence with the territorial government, friends in places that matter. You two need to watch yourselves. We will, Jonas assured him, counting out money. And Larson, thanks for not turning your back on us. The older man nodded, pocketing the coins. Your money's as good as anyone's. And for what it's worth, I respect what you're doing. Not many folks have the spine to stand up to Ketter. He lowered his voice further. But having spine and having sense aren't always the same thing. Be careful out there. They were loading their supplies onto the pack horse when a young boy came running up, breathless and wide-eyed. Mr. Hale? Miss Wynne? My pa says to tell you, Ketter's men are at the saloon. They're drinking heavy and talking loud about unfinished business. Jonas pressed a coin into the boy's hand. Tell your pa we appreciate the warning. Now get home and stay there. The boy nodded and scurried off. Jonas and Alara exchanged glances. We should leave, Alara said. Now, before they see us. Agreed. Jonas checked their loads one final time, his movements economical and practiced. We ride hard, don't stop until we're home. If they follow, then we deal with it. Alara swung into her saddle, her hand automatically checking the rifle bead. But Jonas, you can't live like this forever. Always looking over our shoulders, always waiting for the next attack. I know. His face was grim as he mounted. But I'm working on something. Give me a few days. They rode out of town at a steady pace, not running but not dawdling either. The trail home felt longer than usual, every shadow a potential threat, every sound making them tense. But they made it back to the ranch without incident, and Jonas immediately set about checking their defenses while Alara tended the horses and started dinner. That night, after they'd eaten and secured the cabin, Jonas spread a map on the table. It was hand-drawn, showing the valley and surrounding territory in careful detail. This is Ketter's land, he said, shading an area that encompassed most of the valley floor. And this is ours. See how his northern pasture depends on water flowing down from our creek? That's why he wants our land so badly, Alara said, studying the map. Without our water, his cattle can't graze that section. Right, but here's what Ketter doesn't know. Jonas pointed to an area east of their property. There's another water source up in the high country, a spring-fed lake that drains into a different watershed. If someone were to develop that water, run it through irrigation ditches, Ketter's northern pasture would have all the water it needs without touching our creek. That's brilliant. Alara looked up at him with admiration. But who's going to do that, and why hasn't anyone thought of it before? Because the land around that lake is rough, hard to work, and currently belongs to the territory, unclaimed and unimproved. Jonas's expression was intent. But there's a provision in the Homestead Act. Any citizen can file a claim on unclaimed territory, and if they improve it, build structures, develop water resources, it becomes theirs after 5 years. Alara's mind raced ahead. So if you filed a claim on that land, developed the water system, you could sell or lease the water rights to Keter. Give him what he needs without taking our property. Not me. Jonas reached across the table and took her hand. Us. We'd file the claim together, as partners. Equal shares in everything. The ranch, the water rights, the future. Jonas, I can't. That's your land, your work. It's our work. It's been our work since the day I bid on you at that auction. His grip tightened.
Alara, I've been thinking about this since Keter first started making bets. I'm not doing this just to buy him off. I'm doing this because it's the smart play. If we develop that water source, we control something he needs. That gives us leverage, protection. He can't move against us without risking his own future. It's dangerous filing a claim on land he might want. Everything out here is dangerous. Jonas's smile was grim. But this gives us a fighting chance, and more than that, if we pull this off, we'd have resources to expand our own operation, build something bigger, something that could sustain us for decades. Alara looked at the map, at Jonas's rough sketches of proposed irrigation ditches and water systems, and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was vision, ambition, building something that would last beyond their own lifetime. When do we file? She asked. Tomorrow. I've already drafted the paperwork.
We just need to ride to the territorial office, file the claim, and start work. He paused. But Alara, this means staying. Really staying. No more thoughts about going back to St. Louis or anywhere else. This is a commitment to this land, to this life. To you, she said softly. It's a commitment to you, to us. And I made that choice the night of the fire, Jonas. I'm not going anywhere. He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce tenderness that made her throat tight. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. She pulled back enough to look at him. And I don't deserve you. So maybe we're even. They kissed then, slow and deep, and for a moment the danger and uncertainty faded away, leaving only the two of them and the future they were building together. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and they set out early for the territorial office in Helena. A 2-day journey that would take them far from the ranch, but was necessary to file their claim properly. Jonas left detailed instructions with their nearest neighbor, Ed Morrison, asking him to keep an eye on the place and fire warning shots if anyone came snooping around. Morrison, a weathered rancher in his 50s with a wife and 3 grown sons, had clasped Jonas's hand firmly. You're doing a smart thing, Hale. That water development could change the whole valley. You get that filed, and I'll make sure your place is still standing when you get back. They rode hard, camping rough at night and pushing through the mountain passes before more snow could close them. The territorial office was a squat building in Helena, presided over by a bored clerk who barely looked up from his paperwork as they filed their claim. Names? Jonas Hale and Alara Wynn, filing jointly. That got the clerk's attention. He looked up, his eyes moving between them with interest. Joint filing isn't common. You two married? Jonas hesitated, and Alara saw the conflict in his face. They weren't married, not legally, though they'd been living as partners for months now, but saying so might complicate the filing, might give someone grounds to challenge their claim later. Not yet, Alara said firmly, stepping forward. But we will be, and we want this claim filed in both names regardless. The clerk shrugged. Your business, not mine. Just need both signatures. He pushed the paperwork across the desk, and they signed side by side, their names linking them together in official record. As they left the office, Jonas caught her arm. Did you mean that? About us getting married? Did you mean it when you asked me to file this claim as partners? Of course I did. Then yes, I meant it. Alara smiled up at him. Unless you're having second thoughts? No second thoughts. Jonas's expression was serious. But Alara, I want to do this right. Not some rushed thing at a territorial office, not some arrangement of convenience. I want... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I want to marry you properly.
with witnesses and vows and a future that's built on more than just survival. When this is over, Alara said softly, understanding what he needed. When Keter's threat is ended and we're safe. When we can stand up in front of the valley and claim each other without fear, that's when we'll marry. Promise? I promise. They sealed it with a kiss there on the street in Helena, not caring who saw, and then rode for home. They reached the ranch 2 days later to find it standing but not untouched. Someone had been there. Morrison met them at the property line with a grim expression. They came the night after you left, he said without preamble. 4 riders, maybe 5. We fired warning shots like you asked, and they cleared out. But they left something. He led them to the cabin door, where a notice had been nailed to the wood. It was an official-looking document, stamped and sealed, declaring that Jonas Hale's water rights were under dispute and pending territorial review. It's dated 3 days ago, Morrison said, which means Keter filed this before you filed your claim. He's trying to tie up your water rights in legal proceedings, probably hoping to force you to sell while it's all sorted out. Jonas studied the document, his jaw tight. This is garbage. My water rights were filed and approved 3 years ago. There's no legitimate basis for dispute. Doesn't matter if it's legitimate, Morrison said grimly. Just matters that it'll take months, maybe years to resolve. And in the meantime, Keter can tell everyone your title's clouded, make it impossible for you to sell or leverage your property. Alara felt cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He's trying to starve us out, make it so we can't get credit, can't do business, can't survive. That's about the size of it. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Look, I don't want to tell you folks what to do, but this is going to get uglier before it gets better. My boys and I will keep watching your place, but if Ketter's willing to use the courts and his money, we're not leaving, Jonas said flatly. But Ed, I appreciate everything you've done. Don't put yourself or your family at risk for it. If Keter comes again, you stay on your own property. Can't promise that, Morrison said with a slight smile. We're neighbors. That means something out here. After Morrison left, Jonas and Alara stood looking at the notice nailed to their door. Finally, Jonas tore it down and threw it in the fire. That won't make it go away, Alara said quietly. No, but it makes me feel better. He turned to her and she saw the exhaustion in his face, the weight of fighting a battle on multiple fronts. I should have seen this coming. Should have known Keter would use legal tactics along with physical intimidation. How could you have known? You're not a lawyer or a politician. You're just a man trying to defend his home. Our home, Jonas corrected. And that's the problem, isn't it? I'm just a man. One man with no connections, no money for fancy lawyers, no influence with the territorial government. How do I fight someone who has all of that? Alara crossed to him and took his hands. You fight smart. You use what you have, knowledge of the land, the respect of your neighbors, the righteousness of your cause. And you don't fight alone. She squeezed his hands. Jonas, that claim we filed in Helena, that's our countermove. When Keter finds out we've secured rights to alternative water that could serve his northern pasture, he'll have to deal with us. We'll have something he needs. Unless he just takes it by force, he can't. Not without showing his hand completely, not without turning the whole valley against him. Alara's voice was firm with conviction. There are limits even to his power, Jonas. Lines even he won't cross publicly. We just have to be smart enough, strong enough to hold out until we can force a negotiation. Jonas pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. When did you get so strategic? I had a good teacher, a stubborn rancher who taught me that giving up isn't an option. They stood there for a long moment, drawing strength from each other, and then got to work. There were repairs to make, defenses to strengthen, and a long winter still ahead. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. The weeks that followed fell into a tense routine. Jonas rode out every few days to begin preliminary work on the new water claim, surveying the land, marking out where ditches would go, building a small shelter near the lake to establish residency. Alara stayed at the ranch most days, maintaining their home base, but sometimes she rode with him, keeping watch while he worked. Ketter's harassment continued but changed character. Instead of direct attacks, he filed more legal challenges, disputing their property boundaries,
claiming historical water rights that predated Jonas's claim, even attempting to have Jonas's original purchase declared invalid on a technicality. Each challenge required time and money to defend, slowly bleeding their resources. But Jonas and Alara had resources Keter didn't account for. The valley's small ranchers, tired of his bullying, began quietly supporting them, sharing information about Keter's movements, providing testimony for legal challenges, even sending supplies when they could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep fighting. And then, 6 weeks after the barn fire, everything came to a head. Jonas was working on the irrigation project, digging a test ditch to determine soil composition, when he heard horses approaching. Alara, who'd been keeping watch from a nearby ridge, fired 2 warning shots, their signal for multiple riders. Jonas grabbed his rifle and took cover behind a stand of rocks. 5 riders emerged from the tree line, and at their head was Vance Keter himself. "Hail!" Ketter's voice echoed across the lake. "I want to talk." "Then talk from there." Jonas kept the rifle trained on the group. "And keep your hands where I can see them." Keter made a show of raising his hands. "I'm not here for violence. I'm here with a proposition." "I'm listening." "You're a stubborn man, Hale. I respect that. But this fight is costing both of us time and money." Ketter's voice was reasonable, almost friendly. "So here's my offer. You sell me your original ranch, I'll pay fair market value, no dispute, and you keep this new claim, develop your water up here. We both win." Jonas didn't lower the rifle. "And what happens to Alara?" "The girl?" Keter shrugged. "That's your business. Take her with you, marry her, whatever you want. I don't care about her. I care about water rights and prime grazing land." From her position on the ridge, Alara heard every word and felt ice form in her veins. Keter was offering Jonas a way out, a way to save himself and his future at the cost of the home they'd built together, the cabin where they'd survived together, the land where they'd fought side by side. Would Jonas take it? Could she blame him if he did? It was a good offer, a practical offer, the kind of compromise that survival often demanded. Jonas was silent for a long moment, and Alara held her breath, waiting. Then Jonas lowered the rifle slightly and walked forward until he was 20 feet from Ketter's group. Close enough to talk without shouting, close enough to see each other's faces clearly. "No," Jonas said simply. Ketter's expression darkened. "That's not very smart, Hale." "Maybe not, but it's honest." Jonas's voice was steady, certain. "That ranch isn't just property to me, Keter. It's my home. Our home. Every fence post, every repaired board, every meal cooked and morning woken, they're all memories now. They're the proof that I built something that matters. And I'm not selling that. Not for any price you could offer." "Then you're a fool," Keter spat. "Because I'll bury you in legal fees. I'll make sure no one in the valley will do business with you. You'll do what you've been doing," Jonas interrupted. "You'll harass and intimidate and file false claims. But you won't win. Because Alara was right. There are limits to your power. Lines you can't cross without turning everyone against you. And we're going to keep fighting, keep building, keep proving that good people don't have to bow to bullies." "Good people?" Keter laughed, but it sounded forced. "You mean a murderer and a whore bought at auction? That's what you're calling good people?" Jonas moved faster than Keter expected, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. His fist connected with Ketter's jaw with a crack that echoed off the mountains, sending the older man sprawling from his saddle. Ketter's men reached for their guns, but Alara's rifle shot split the air, kicking up dirt at their horses' feet. The animals danced nervously, and the men froze. "Next one goes through flesh," Alara called out, her voice carrying clear and cold. "Anyone wants to test that? Go ahead and draw." No one moved. Jonas stood over Keter, his fists clenched, his face a mask of controlled rage. "You listen to me, Vance," Jonas said quietly, but his voice carried. "That woman is worth 100 of you. She's got more courage, more integrity, more pure decency than you'll ever understand. And if you ever speak of her like that again, if you so much as think her name with disrespect, I'll do to you what I did to those raiders in Colorado. Do you understand me?" Keter wiped blood from his mouth, his eyes wide with genuine fear. Whatever he'd heard about Jonas's past, whatever reputation had followed him to Montana, he'd just gotten a direct glimpse of it. "This isn't over," Keter said, but his voice shook. "Yes, it is." Jonas stepped back, his hand dropping to his gun belt in a deliberate gesture. Because here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop all your false legal claims. You're going to leave us alone. And in exchange, when we finish developing the water rights on this new property, we'll lease you access at a fair rate. You'll get the water your northern pasture needs, we'll get steady income, and everyone wins. And if I refuse, then we sell the water rights to your competitors. There are 3 other ranchers in this valley who'd love access to year-round water. We'll make sure they get it, and you can watch your northern pasture turn to dust. Jonas's smile was cold. Your choice, Vance. Peace or mutual destruction. Ketter climbed slowly to his feet, his hand on his swelling jaw. For a long moment, he stared at Jonas with undisguised hatred. Then his eyes moved to the ridge where Alara stood, still holding her rifle, still ready to fire if needed. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite respect, but a grudging acknowledgement of reality. I'll think about your offer, he said finally. You do that. But Ketter? Jonas waited until the older man met his eyes. If you come at us again, if you hurt her, if you threaten our home one more time, there won't be any more offers. There'll just be consequences, the kind I learned to deliver 11 years ago, the kind that are final. Ketter mounted his horse without another word and rode away, his men following. Jonas stood watching until they disappeared into the trees, then slowly unclenched his fists and looked up at the ridge. Alara lowered her rifle and scrambled down to meet him, nearly falling in her haste. When she reached him, she threw her arms around his neck, holding him so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her chest. You said no, she whispered against his shoulder. He offered you everything, and you said no. Of course I said no. Jonas pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. Alara, did you really think I'd sell our home, trade our future for some practical arrangement? I didn't know. It was a good offer, Jonas. I could have betrayed everything we built together. I could have chosen safety over honor, practicality over love. His thumb traced her cheekbone. But survival isn't living, remember? You taught me that. You taught me that some things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. She kissed him then, fierce and desperate and full of relief. And when they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Do you think he'll accept? Alara asked. The water lease? He'd be a fool not to. It solves his problem without costing him his pride. Jonas looked back toward the lake, toward the future they were building with their own hands. But even if he doesn't, we'll survive. We'll find another way. Because that's what we do, Alara. We survive, we adapt, and we build something better. Together, she said firmly. Together, he agreed. They stood there in the shadow of the mountains, 2 people who'd found each other through violence and desperation and had forged something strong enough to withstand anything the world threw at them. The winter wind was cold, the future was uncertain, but for the first time since that action, Alara felt completely, utterly safe. Not because the danger had passed. It hadn't, not entirely, but because she knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, Jonas would face it beside her, and she beside him. That was worth everything. That was survival transformed into living. That was home. 3 days passed in tense silence. Jonas and Alara worked on the irrigation project during daylight hours, always armed, always watching the tree line for riders that didn't come. At night, they returned to the ranch, securing the cabin and sleeping in shifts, neither willing to be caught unprepared again. The waiting was worse than the fighting, each hour stretching out like wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. On the 4th morning, Sheriff Booker arrived at dawn, his horse lathered from hard riding. Jonas met him at the door with a rifle, but lowered it when he saw the older man's expression. It's done, Booker said without preamble, swinging down from his saddle. Ketter's dropping all his legal challenges. His lawyer filed the paperwork yesterday in Helena. Alara emerged from the cabin, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning cold. Just like that? After everything he's done? Not quite just like that. Booker accepted the coffee Jonas poured him gratefully, warming his hands on the tin cup. Word got around about what happened up at the lake, about Hale's offer for the water lease, and about Ketter getting knocked on his ass for insulting Miss Wynne. He smiled slightly. The Valley's been talking about nothing else for days. Turns out a lot of folks are tired of Ketter's bullying, and seeing someone stand up to him, really stand up, not just talk, it changed something. What do you mean? Jonas asked warily. I mean, 3 of the smaller ranchers approached Ketter 2 days ago with an ultimatum. They told him if he didn't settle this peacefully, they'd band together and make sure his cattle couldn't reach market come spring. They'd block the passes, refuse to let his herds cross their land, make it impossible for him to do business. Booker took a long drink of coffee. Ketter's powerful, but he's not more powerful than the whole valley united against him. He knows when he's beat.
Alara felt something loosen in her chest. A knot of tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. So it's really over? The violence is over. The legal harassment is over. Booker's expression became serious. But you'll still need to negotiate the water lease and still need to finish developing your claim up at the lake. That's going to take time and money. And Ketter's not going to be friendly about it. He'll hold a grudge till the day he dies, but he won't move against you again. He can't afford to. Jonas set down his cup, his hand finding Alara. What changed, Tom? What really made the difference? You did. Booker looked between them. Both of you. When you bought her at that auction, people thought you were either crazy or desperate. When you two survived the barn fire together, some folks started wondering if maybe there was more to the story. But when you turned down Ketter's buyout offer, when you chose principle over profit, he shook his head admiringly. That's when people realized you weren't just fighting for land. You were fighting for something that mattered, for each other, for the idea that good people shouldn't have to bow to bullies just because it's practical. We were just trying to survive, Alara said softly. No, ma'am. You were trying to live. There's a difference, and everyone in the valley saw it. Booker stood, preparing to leave. One more thing. Morrison and the other ranchers, they're planning something. Wouldn't tell me what. Said it's a surprise. But you might want to clean yourselves up and expect visitors in the next few days. After Booker left, Jonas and Alara stood on the porch watching the sun climb over the mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and rose. The world looked different somehow. Still hard, still demanding, but no longer quite so hostile. We did it, Alara said wonderingly. We actually did it. We survived, Jonas agreed. And now we get to do the harder part. What's that? Build a life worth the fight. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Alara, I meant what I said before. About doing this right. About marrying you properly, with witnesses and vows, and a future built on more than just survival. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, worn leather cracked with age. This was Sarah's. It's the only thing I kept from Kansas. I've been carrying it for 11 years, not sure what to do with it. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, tarnished but beautiful in its plainness. I'm not asking you to replace her. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm asking you to build something new with me, something that honors what we've both lost and survived, but looks forward instead of back. Alara took the box with trembling hands, tears blurring her vision. Jonas, I can't take her ring. That's... She'd want you to have it. Jonas's voice was thick with emotion. Sarah believed in second chances and the possibility of healing after terrible loss. The last thing she said to me before those raiders came was, promise me you'll live, not just survive. I broke that promise for 11 years, but you taught me how to keep it. You showed me that love isn't about replacing what's lost. It's about being brave enough to try again. Yes, Alara whispered, her word barely audible. Yes, I'll marry you. Today, tomorrow, whenever you want. I'll marry you, Jonas Hale, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that we were worth fighting for. He slipped the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for her, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her ache. When they finally broke apart, both were crying, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow, of beginning rather than ending. Morrison said to clean ourselves up, Jonas said, brushing tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, and to expect visitors. I think I know what's coming. What? I think our neighbors are planning to help us, really help us, not just with words, but with action. Jonas smiled, and it was the first time Alara had seen him look truly, completely happy. I think we're about to discover what community really means out here. He was right. 2 days later, on a crystalline Sunday morning, when the air was so cold it hurt to breathe, they heard the sound of multiple wagons approaching. Jonas and Alara emerged from the cabin to find a procession coming up the valley. Morrison and his sons in the lead, followed by a dozen other families from the surrounding ranches. Morrison climbed down from his wagon with a grin. "Heard you two might be planning a wedding. Thought you could use some help getting ready." What followed was a whirlwind of activity that left Alara breathless and overwhelmed. The women took charge of the cabin, transforming it from bachelor quarters into something suitable for a wedding ceremony. They hung garlands of pine boughs, placed wildflowers preserved in honey on the table, draped the rough walls with clean white sheets that made the space feel larger and more elegant. Someone had brought a dress, simple calico but new and clean, with lace at the collar that must have cost a fortune in these parts. "Can't have you getting married in work clothes," Morrison's wife said firmly, pressing the dress into Alara's hands. "Every bride deserves something special." Meanwhile, the men worked on the barn, completing repairs that Jonas had been doing piecemeal for months. They replaced the entire burned section with fresh lumber, reinforced the roof, even built a new lean-to for additional storage. The sound of hammering and sawing filled the valley, punctuated by laughter and good-natured ribbing. Jonas stood watching, clearly overwhelmed. "You didn't have to do all this," he said to Morrison. "Yes, we did." Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. "You stood up to Keter when the rest of us were too scared or too practical to do it. You showed us that some things are worth fighting for, worth risking for. This is us saying thank you, and this is us saying you're not alone out here. You're part of this valley now, part of this community. What hurts you hurts us. What helps you helps us." By late afternoon, everything was ready. The cabin glowed with candlelight and smelled of pine and cooking food. The women had prepared a feast with contributions from every family: roasted venison, fresh bread, preserved vegetables, even a cake sweetened with precious sugar and honey. Someone had brought a fiddle, and another had a harmonica, promising music for dancing after the ceremony. Alara stood in the bedroom area behind the canvas curtain, wearing the borrowed dress and trying not to cry at the kindness of these near strangers who'd become something more. Morrison's wife helped her braid her hair and pin it up with wildflowers, transforming her from a work-worn rancher's partner into a bride. "You're good for him," the older woman said, meeting Alara's eyes in the small mirror Jonas kept for shaving. "I've known Jonas Hale for 3 years, and I never once saw him smile until you came along. Whatever you two have been through together, whatever you've survived, it made you both stronger. That's rare, Miss Wynne. Most hardship breaks people or makes them bitter. But you two, you let it forge you into something better." "I don't know what I did to deserve this," Alara said, gesturing at the dress, the cabin, the community gathered outside. "6 months ago, I was being sold at auction like livestock. Now you're home." Morrison's wife squeezed her shoulder. "That's what this is, child. Home isn't a place. It's people who see you for who you really are and love you anyway. It's fighting through the hard times together and celebrating the good ones. You and Jonas, you built that. Now we're all here to witness it and be part of it." Outside, someone called that it was time. Alara took a deep breath, smoothed the dress one final time, and stepped out. The cabin was packed with people, but they parted to create a path to where Jonas stood by the fireplace. He'd cleaned up, shaved, and was wearing what was clearly his best shirt, still rough by city standards, but pressed and clean. But it was his expression that stole Alara's breath. Wonder and love and gratitude all mixed together, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real. Sheriff Booker stood by the fireplace, having agreed to perform the ceremony in his capacity as a territorial official. He'd brought a Bible and was clearly taking his role seriously. Alara walked toward Jonas through the gathered neighbors, people who'd started as strangers but had become witnesses to their journey, and felt tears streaming down her face. When she reached Jonas, he took her hands in his, and she could feel him trembling. "Dearly beloved," Booker began, his gravelly voice taking on a formal cadence, "we are gathered here in the sight of God, and these witnesses to join Jonas Hale and Alara Wynne in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." He paused, looking at them both. "Now,
I know the traditional ceremony has a lot of words about duty and obligation, but I think what we've all witnessed over these past months is that these two already understand what marriage means. They fought for each other, protected each other, built something together out of nothing. They've proven that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day, especially on the hard days. Someone in the crowd murmured agreement, and Booker smiled slightly before continuing. Jonas, do you take Alara to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part? I do. Jonas's voice was strong and clear. I do. And I promise to spend every day proving it. Alara, do you take Jonas to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part? I do, Alara said, her voice breaking slightly. With all my heart, I do. Then by the power vested in me by the Montana Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Booker's stern expression softened into a genuine smile. Jonas, you may kiss your bride. Jonas cupped Alara's face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her softly, reverently, while their neighbors erupted in cheers and applause. When they broke apart, both were laughing through their tears, and Alara felt something settle in her soul, a sense of rightness, of completion, of finally being exactly where she was meant to be. The celebration that followed was raucous and joyful. The fiddle player struck up a lively tune, and Morrison insisted on dancing with the bride first, spinning Alara around the crowded cabin until she was dizzy and breathless with laughter. Jonas danced with every woman present, even the children, his usual reserve crumbling under the weight of community and celebration. Food was eaten, toasts were made, some eloquent, others hilariously inappropriate, and stories were shared about the valley's history, about other couples who'd faced hard times and survived. As the evening wore on and the children began falling asleep in corners, the conversation turned more serious. "What's your plan now?" Morrison asked Jonas, both men standing outside in the cold night air, taking a break from the crowded warmth. "For the water development, I mean. We'll finish the survey work this spring, start digging the main irrigation ditch by summer," Jonas said, his breath pluming in the cold. "It's going to take at least 2 years to complete the full system. But once it's done, the whole valley changes," Morrison finished. "Access to year-round water means we can expand our herds, improve our grazing. Hell, we might even be able to grow actual crops up here instead of just raising cattle." He paused, then added carefully, "There's been talk among us smaller ranchers about pooling resources, maybe forming a cooperative, help each other with big projects, share equipment, that sort of thing. We'd want you and Alara to be part of it." Jonas was quiet for a moment, understanding the significance of what was being offered. "You'd trust us with that? After everything?" "Because of everything," Morrison corrected. "You two showed us what's possible when people stand together instead of letting themselves get divided. Keter ruled this valley by keeping us separate, keeping us scared. You changed that. Now we want to build on it." He extended his hand. "So what do you say? Are you in?" Jonas shook his hand firmly. "We're in. And Ed, thank you. For everything. For standing with us. For organizing this. For..." His voice broke slightly. "For giving us a community. I've been alone so long I'd forgotten what that felt like." "Well, you're not alone anymore. Neither of you are. Welcome to the valley, Jonas. Really welcome." They returned to the cabin to find Alara sitting by the fire, surrounded by the other women, deep in conversation about spring planting and preservation techniques. She looked up when Jonas entered, and the smile she gave him was radiant, complete, the smile of a woman who'd found her place in the world. The celebration continued until past midnight, when the last families finally loaded their sleeping children into wagons and headed home through the moonlit snow. Morrison was the last to leave, and he paused at the door with a final piece of advice. "Keter sent word through his lawyer," he said quietly. "He's accepting your terms for the water lease. Fair rate, 20-year contract, option to renew. His pride's hurt, but he's not stupid. He knows a good deal when he sees it." "That's good news," Jonas said, surprised. I half expected him to hold out longer. He might have, except for one thing. Morrison smiled. His own ranch hands were talking about how you stood up for Alara, how you chose her over an easy buyout, about real partnership, real marriage. Turns out some of his men have wives and daughters. They're not too pleased with how he treated Miss Wint, Mrs. Hale now, I suppose. Ketter's smart enough to know when he's losing the people who work for him. After Morrison left, Jonas and Alara stood alone in their cabin for the first time as husband and wife. The space still smelled of pine and candle wax and celebration. But now it was just the two of them. The future stretched out ahead like an unwritten page. Mrs. Hale, Jonas said softly, testing the name. How does it feel? Right, Alara answered immediately. It feels right. She moved into his arms, resting her head against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. Jonas, when you bid on me at that auction, did you ever imagine we'd end up here? Married, surrounded by community, building something that matters? No, he admitted, his arms tightening around her. When I bid on you, I was just trying to save you from Grimes. I told myself it was practicality, that I needed help around the ranch. But the truth is, I saw something in your eyes that called to something in me. Some recognition that we were both survivors, both damaged, both looking for a reason to keep going. He pulled back to look at her. You gave me that reason, Alara. You gave me a future when I thought I was done with them. You gave me the same thing, she said, reaching up to trace his jaw. You gave me dignity when the world wanted to strip it away. You gave me partnership when I expected to be treated as property. You gave me love when I thought I was unworthy of it. You were never unworthy, Jonas said fiercely. Never. From the moment I saw you on that platform, I knew you were worth fighting for. Worth everything. They kissed then, long and deep, and it was different from their previous kisses. Not desperate or afraid or shadowed by danger, but full of promise and hope, and the simple joy of knowing they had time. All the time in the world. Later, lying together in the darkness with the fire burning low, Jonas spoke into the silence. I've been thinking about what Morrison said, about forming a cooperative, building something bigger than just our individual ranches. It's a good idea, Alara murmured, half asleep against his shoulder. It is, but I've been thinking even bigger than that. Jonas shifted to look at her, his expression earnest in the dim firelight. What if we did more than just develop water and form a cooperative? What if we started a school? That woke Alara up. A school? There are at least a dozen families in this valley with children. Right now, those kids are growing up barely able to read and write because the nearest school is a 2-day ride away. But if we built something here, hired a teacher, made it accessible. He stopped, suddenly uncertain. Is that crazy? Too ambitious? It's ambitious, Alara agreed, but not crazy. Jonas, that's brilliant. Education is how communities grow, how they become more than just collections of isolated ranches. Her mind was already racing ahead. We could use that old line shack near Morrison's place, the one that's been abandoned. It's centrally located, and with some work it could be converted. And I could teach, at least at first, until we could afford to hire someone permanent. You'd do that? Of course I would. I had 8 years of good education before I went to live with my aunt, and she made sure I had more after that, even if it was just to make me a more accomplished ornament. Alara's voice was bitter on the last words, but then softened. But it wasn't wasted. I can teach reading, writing, arithmetic, basic history, and science. It's not much, but it's more than these children have now. Jonas kissed her forehead. Every time I think I can't love you more, you prove me wrong. Right back at you, Mr. Hale. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, both imagining the future they were building together. A future with water development and cooperatives and school. A future where the next generation wouldn't have to fight as hard as they had, because their parents had fought those battles for them. Jonas, Alara said eventually, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you still think about Sarah? About what happened? He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he finally said. I'll always carry her memory. But Alara, it's different now. For years, that memory was a weight that dragged me down, made me afraid to live. But you showed me it could be something else. A reminder of what's precious, of why it's worth fighting for love, even when it's terrifying.
Sarah's gone, and I'll always wish I could have saved her. But you, his voice thickened with emotion. You saved me. You brought me back to life. And I'm grateful for both things now. Grateful for the 3 years I had with Sarah. Grateful for the rest of my life I get to have with you. I love you, Alara whispered. So much it scares me sometimes. Good, Jonas said, echoing her words from months ago. Be scared. Be terrified. But don't stop loving. Don't stop fighting. Don't stop building. Never, she promised. We're in this together now, for better or worse, remember? I remember. And Alara? He turned to face her fully. I know there's been so much focus on surviving, on fighting, on just getting through each day. But I want you to know something. This life we're building, it's not just about endurance anymore. It's about joy, about waking up grateful for another day with you, about looking forward to watching our children grow up in this valley, about growing old together and telling our grandchildren about how we met. Children, Alara repeated softly, the word full of possibility. You want children? With you? Yes. When we're ready, when things are more stable. I want to fill this cabin with life and laughter and the sound of small feet running across these floors. I want to teach them about the land, about working hard and loving deeply and standing up for what's right. And I want to watch you teach them to read, to think, to dream bigger than this valley. He paused. But only if you want that too. I know we haven't talked about it and there's no pressure. I want it, Alara interrupted, her voice fierce with certainty. I want all of it. The children, the school, the community we're building. I want to grow old with you in this valley and know that we made a difference, that we left it better than we found it. They sealed that promise with another kiss, and as they drifted towards sleep, both felt the same profound sense of gratitude. They had survived so much. Violence, loss, loneliness, despair. They had fought for their right to exist, to love, to build something meaningful. And now, finally, they could stop just surviving and start truly living. Spring came early that year, the snow melting in sudden rushing torrents that swelled the creek and turned the meadows into temporary lake. Jonas and Alara worked from dawn to dusk, dividing their time between maintaining their ranch and developing the new water claim. The work was backbreaking, but they were never alone. Morrison and his sons came regularly to help with the heavy labor. Other neighbors contributed supplies, tools, expertise. The Valley Cooperative was forming organically, people naturally stepping up to support each other. By late May, the main irrigation ditch was taking shape, and Jonas stood on a ridge overlooking the work with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. Alara joined him, carrying lunch in a basket, and they sat together in the warm spring sunshine, watching water begin to flow through their carefully engineered channel. It's working, Alara said wonderingly. Jonas, it's actually working. It is. He pulled her close, kissing her temple. By this time next year, Ketter's northern pasture will have steady water. In 2 years, we'll have enough infrastructure to supply water to 4 different ranches. The valley's going to transform. And the school? Alara asked. Morrison said his sons finished converting the old line shack last week. They did. Oh, It's not fancy, but it's solid. Room for 20 children, a wood stove for heat, even a small attached room you can use for an office or library. Jonas smiled at her excitement. Morrison's already spread word to all the families. You'll have at least 15 students when you open in the fall. 15, Alara breathed. That's more than I hoped. Jonas, we're really doing this. We're building something that matters. We are. And Alara? He turned to face her fully. I have something to tell you. Something I should have told you months ago, but I was afraid. Her expression grew concerned. What is it? When I tracked those raiders to Colorado, when I dealt with them, I didn't just kill them, though God knows they deserved it. I found the money they'd stolen from all the places they'd raided, including my ranch. It was a considerable sum, and I took it. Used it to buy this property, to start over. He met her eyes. Some people might say that makes me a thief, that it wasn't my money to take. It was justice, Alara said firmly. They stole from innocent people, destroyed lives, killed your wife.
Taking that money back was the least they owed. Maybe. But the point is, we're not as broke as I've been pretending. I've been keeping most of that money hidden, afraid to use it because I didn't want questions about where it came from. But it's ours, yours and mine. Enough to hire a proper teacher eventually so you don't have to do it all yourself. Enough to expand the ranch, buy more cattle, really build something substantial. Alara processed this slowly. How much money are we talking about? Enough. Jonas's smile was slight. Enough to never worry about one bad winter destroying us. Enough to help other families in the valley when times get hard. Enough to build that future we've been dreaming about. Instead of being angry about the deception, Alara started laughing. Jonas Hale, you've been sitting on a fortune this whole time while we scraped and saved and worried about surviving winter? I know, I'm sorry, I should have... No. She kissed him to stop the apology. No, I understand why you kept it secret. But Jonas, we can stop being afraid now. We can start building instead of just surviving. We can be generous instead of just cautious. We can help others the way people helped us. That's what I was thinking. Jonas pulled her closer. Morrison's son wants to start his own ranch, but can't afford the land. We could loan him the money, get him started. And Sarah Thompson's husband died last winter. She's struggling to keep their place going with 3 young children. We could help her hire hands, make sure she doesn't lose everything. There are a dozen families in this valley. We could make a real difference for. Then let's do it, Alara said decisively. Let's take that money that came from violence and pain and use it to build something good. That's the best revenge against those raiders, Jonas. Not killing them, that was just justice. But taking what they stole and using it to create community, to help people, to build futures, that's how we really defeat evil. By proving that good is stronger, that love outlasts hate, that hope matters more than fear. They sat there on the ridge overlooking their valley, making plans and dreaming dreams, and for the first time in either of their lives, the future felt not just possible, but inevitable. They had survived the worst and come out stronger. Now they would thrive. The wedding had been in late winter. By the time autumn rolled around again, the entire valley had transformed in subtle but significant ways. The irrigation system was operational, water flowing steadily to 4 different ranches, including Ketter's Northern Pasture. The Valley Cooperative had formalized, with Jonas elected as one of the board members. The school had opened with 17 students and was already planning an expansion for the following year. Morrison's son had his own small ranch now, and Sarah Thompson had kept her land and was even turning a profit. And Alara was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to tell Jonas until she was certain, until she'd made the long trip to Helena to see a doctor and confirm what her body already knew. On a golden October evening, with the aspen leaves turning the mountains into a patchwork of gold and green, she told him. They were in the barn, tending the horses together as they did every evening, when Alara said casually, "I've been thinking we might need to expand the cabin." Jonas looked up from brushing the mare. "Yeah, why's that?" "Because in about 6 months it's going to be rather crowded with just the 2 of us." He stared at her blankly for a moment, and she watched the realization dawn across his face. The curry brush clattered to the floor as he crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. "You're sure?" His hands hovered near her waist, afraid to touch, afraid this was a dream. "The doctor and Helena confirmed it. We're having a baby, Jonas." Alara took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach. "Our baby, due in late April." Jonas dropped to his knees in the barn straw, his arms wrapping around her waist, his forehead pressed against her middle. She felt him shaking and realized he was crying, deep, wrenching sobs of joy and relief and overwhelming gratitude. "I didn't think," he managed between sobs. "After Sarah, after everything, I didn't think I'd ever have this. A family, a future, something to build for." Alara ran her fingers through his hair, her own tears falling freely. "We're going to be parents. We're going to bring a child into this valley we've helped build, this community we've helped create. They're going to grow up surrounded by people who care about them, in a world we made safer and better." Jonas stood, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around despite her laughing protests. When he set her down, his face was radiant with joy. We need to tell people, he said. We need to celebrate. We need to what? We need to finish with the horses, Alara said practically. But she was grinning. And then, yes, we can tell Morrison tomorrow, and the news will spread through the valley like wildfire. But tonight, can it just be ours? Just us? Our cabin? Our baby? Yeah, Jonas agreed softly. Yeah, I'd like that. They finished their evening chores and went inside, where Jonas insisted on doing everything while Alara sat by the fire. He cooked dinner, simple but edible. He'd learned a lot over the past year. He cleaned up. He added more wood to the fire and made sure the cabin was warm enough. And then he sat beside her, pulling her into his arms, and they talked about names and nursery arrangements, and whether the baby would have his eyes or hers. I hope they have your courage, Jonas said eventually. Your resilience, your ability to see possibility even in the darkest times. I hope they have your integrity, Alara countered. Your determination to do what's right even when it's hard. Your capacity to love deeply even after terrible loss. They'll have both of us, Jonas said, his hand resting on her stomach. The best parts of both of us. And they'll grow up knowing they're wanted, knowing they're loved, knowing they're part of something bigger than themselves. Tell them, Alara whispered. Tell our baby what kind of world they're coming into. Jonas leaned down, his lips close to her stomach, and spoke softly. You're coming into a world that's hard sometimes, little one. Cold winters and hot summers, and work that never ends. But you're also coming into a world full of possibility. Mountains that touch the sky, and creeks full of trout, and meadows that bloom with wildflowers every spring. You're going to have neighbors who will treat you like family, who will celebrate your victories and help you through your defeats. And you're going to have parents who love you more than life itself, who will teach you to be brave and kind and never, ever give up. He looked up at Alara, and she saw her own joy reflected in his eyes. And your mother, little one, she's the strongest person I've ever known. She survived things that would have broken most people, and she came through it with her capacity for love and tact. You're lucky to be her child. We're both lucky. No, Alara said, pulling him up to kiss him. We're blessed by each other, by this life we've built, by this miracle growing inside me. We're blessed, Jonas, and we're going to be the best parents we can be. The months that followed were a blur of preparation and anticipation. Jonas added a room onto the cabin, working through the winter whenever weather permitted. Alara continued teaching at the school until her pregnancy made the daily ride too difficult, at which point several of the mothers took turns substituting while she worked on lesson plans from home. The Valley women rallied around her, bringing supplies for the baby, sharing advice, including her in a network of female support she'd never experienced before. Keter kept his distance, fulfilling his water lease obligations and otherwise leaving them alone. The Valley Cooperative thrived, expanding beyond water management to include equipment sharing and bulk purchasing. And the school grew, adding 5 more students mid-year when families heard about the quality of education their children were receiving. In late April, on a morning when the meadows were starting to green and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Alara went into labor. Jonas had been prepared for months, had studied every book on childbirth he could get his hands on, had arranged for 2 experienced midwives to be on call. But when it actually started, when Alara gripped his hand and said quietly, Jonas, it's time. He felt every bit of his careful preparation dissolve into pure terror. The labor was long, 18 hours of watching Alara suffer, of feeling utterly helpless, of praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Morrison's wife and Sarah Thompson served as midwives, competent and calm, while Jonas paced and worried and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. But when his son finally entered the world just after dawn, screaming his indignation at the cold Montana air, Jonas felt something break open in his chest. The midwives cleaned the baby quickly and placed him in Alara's arms, and Jonas stood frozen, staring at this tiny, perfect human they'd created. Meet your son, Alara said, exhausted but radiant. Meet Thomas Edward Hale. Thomas, Jonas repeated, his voice breaking. It was his father's name, a man he'd barely known but had loved. You want to name him Thomas? After your father and Edward Morrison, who helped us build this land. Alara looked down at their son,
who'd stopped crying and was now staring up at her with unfocused blue eyes. "He's ours, Jonas. Our baby. Our family. Our future." Jonas sat on the edge of the bed and carefully took his son in his arms. The baby was so small, so impossibly fragile, and yet Jonas could already see Alara in the shape of his mouth, could already imagine teaching him to ride and rope and read,
Could already imagine this tiny person growing up in this valley, maybe taking over the ranch someday, maybe building his own life somewhere else, but always carrying this place in his heart. "Hey there, Thomas," Jonas whispered. "I'm your pa, and I'm going to do everything I can to give you a good life, to teach you right from wrong, to show you what it means to fight for what matters, to love with your whole heart even when it's scary. You're going to grow up surrounded by good people in a beautiful place, and you're going to know every single day that you're loved." Over the next few days, as Alara recovered and Thomas began to settle into a rhythm of eating and sleeping, the entire valley came to celebrate. People brought food and gifts and congratulations, and the tiny cabin was full of laughter and joy, and the kind of community that Jonas had thought was lost to him forever. On Thomas's 5th day of life, Sheriff Booker rode out with an official-looking envelope. Jonas opened it with trepidation, but it turned out to be good news. The territorial government had approved a request from the Valley Cooperative to establish an official town, complete with a post office and territorial recognition. They wanted to name it Hellville, after the couple who'd started the cooperative movement. "We can't call it that," Jonas protested. "It should be something that represents everyone." "It does represent everyone," Morrison said firmly. "You and Alara stood up to Keter when no one else would. You showed us what's possible when people work together. This town exists because of what you started. Let us honor that." So Hellville it became, a small collection of buildings that would grow over the years into a real town with a general store and a proper school building, and eventually even a church. And at the center of it all was the Hale Ranch, where Jonas and Alara raised Thomas and eventually 2 more children, a daughter named Sarah and another son named Michael, reclaiming that name from its association with betrayal and giving it new, better meaning. Years passed. The irrigation system expanded. The cooperative thrived. Keter died in his sleep at 72, his empire broken up among 3 sons who had no interest in their father's feuds. The valley prospered, becoming known throughout the territory as a model of cooperative ranching and community development. And through it all, Jonas and Alara stood at the center, not as rulers, but as partners in a larger enterprise. They watched their children grow, helped their neighbors through hard times, and built a legacy that would outlast them both. On their 20th anniversary, Jonas took Alara back up to the high meadow where they'd confronted Keter all those years ago. The lake was now surrounded by a thriving irrigation system, and several families had built small ranches nearby, all of them prospering from the water they'd helped develop. "Do you remember what I said to you that day?" Jonas asked, holding her hand as they stood looking out over the valley. "You said buying me saved your ranch," Alara recalled, "and loving me saved your life." "I was wrong." Jonas turned to face her, and she saw that he still looked at her the way he had on their wedding day, with wonder and gratitude and bottomless love. "Loving you didn't just save my life. It gave me a life worth living. It gave me purpose and joy and a future I never dreamed possible. You took a broken man who was just surviving and taught him how to thrive, how to build, how to dream, how to be part of something bigger than himself." "We taught each other," Alara said, reaching up to touch his face. He had gray at his temples now, lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the Montana sun, but to her he was still the lonely rancher who'd bid $10 for her freedom. "You taught me courage and resilience and what real partnership looks like. You taught me that I was worth fighting for, that my dreams mattered, that I could build a life on my own terms." They stood there as the sun set over the valley they'd helped create. The town that bore their name spread below them, their children and grandchildren somewhere down there living the lives they'd made possible. And both of them felt the same profound gratitude, not for the easy things, but for the hard ones, for the struggle that had forged them, for the danger that had revealed their strength, for the loneliness that had made their connection so precious. "No one would buy her at the auction," Jonas said softly, "until a cowboy took her in and changed her life forever." "Wrong," Alara corrected gently. "We changed each other's lives, together."
And we're still doing it every single day. Jonas pulled her close, and they stood there in the gathering twilight. Two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something that would last generations. They'd survived violence and loss and despair. They'd fought for their right to exist, to love, to build something meaningful. And they'd won, not because they were stronger or smarter or luckier than everyone else, but because they'd refused to give up on each other or on the possibility of building something better. That was their legacy. Not the ranch, or the town, or the water system, but the simple, radical idea that love and partnership and community could triumph over fear and greed and isolation, that two broken people could heal each other and in the process help heal an entire valley. As they rode back down to their ranch, back to their family, and their life. Both of them carried the same truth in their hearts. Survival isn't living, but choosing to love, even when it's terrifying, even when it costs everything. That's what makes life worth the struggle. That's what changed everything forever. And that's what would echo through the valley long after they were gone. A story told and retold to remind people that sometimes the greatest things begin with a simple choice. To stand up, to fight back, to love fiercely, and to build something worth the battle. Their story became legend in the valley. The auction girl and the lonely rancher who changed the world by refusing to let it break them. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.